The Catholic Church didn't dismiss the ancient Mayan predictions because they were false, but because they struck too close to home. Hidden away in stone passages and secured chambers, church officials maintained silence about a calendar discovered in jungle sanctuaries. A chronology that concluded on December 21st, 2012. Buried within the Vatican's classified documents, ancient correspondence tells of celestial beings, stellar configurations, and a returning serpent when the sun finished its grand journey. This isn't mythology. This is documentation, concealed, protected, and almost lost to history. If mysteries like these intrigue you, make sure to follow along. So get comfortable, shut your eyes, and allow this tale to begin. It started with digits etched in rock, a moment so distant in time that for generations nobody thought it held any significance whatsoever. Yet as the calendar approached December 21st, 2012, an unsettling anxiety emerged in institutions that seldom acknowledge uncertainty. The Vatican was among them. The Great Cycle calendar, developed by ancient Maya more than 2 millennia ago, wasn't simply a method for counting days. It represented a framework based on temporal cycles, some extending beyond entire empires. While Europeans tracked time through monarchs and conflicts, the Maya tracked it through celestial bodies. Their calendar didn't extend infinitely forward like our modern system. Rather, it concluded, and this ending was what the Vatican couldn't dismiss. Concealed deep within the apostolic residence, away from the masses gathering in St. Peter's courtyard, a team of researchers had been monitoring this calendar for years. Not publicly, not transparently, but meticulously. They belong to the Vatican Observatory, a research institution established to examine the cosmos, but frequently assigned to investigate something far more enigmatic: the sequences of divine revelation. Initially, this calendar was regarded as an anthropological artifact examined solely by academic scholars. But as December 21st approached, attitudes transformed. Documentation started emerging from Vatican record keepers, pieces of correspondence penned by evangelists during the 1500s. Those letters contained accounts of Mayan spiritual leaders, of ceremonies conducted under moonlight, and of a revelation that predicted not annihilation, but metamorphosis. One correspondence, discovered hidden behind aged binding in the collection, mentioned a caution. It originated from a Jesuit missionary positioned in the Yucatan who documented in 1679, "They describe a sun that shall descend and ascend once more, yet transformed. The serpent shall emerge, not in flesh, but in flame." That correspondence was never made public. It received classification for internal examination and was stored in the restricted wing of the Vatican archives. What most concerned the Vatican wasn't the prophecy alone, but its precision. The Mayan calendar's concluding moment aligned with an uncommon positioning of Earth, the Sun, and the dark heart of our galaxy, an event astronomers verified would happen just once every 26,000 years. The Maya possessed no optical instruments, yet their calculations indicated this precise cosmic occurrence. The exactness was too remarkable to explain as mere chance. Some Vatican members labelled it fascinating, others deemed it hazardous information, and several quietly considered it sacrilege to disregard. What if this represented not a conclusion but a return to something more ancient than the Church itself? As the moment drew closer, murmurs intensified behind the secured entrances of the archives. Not every prophecy concludes in destruction. Some conclude in quiet, and within the marble corridors of the Vatican, that quiet was starting to fracture. During a pleasant evening in 1533, the initial formal documentation arrived in Rome, handwritten, wax-sealed, and dispatched from the distant frontier of the known world. It came bearing not victory's tone, but subdued concern. The correspondence originated from a Spanish bishop recently assigned to the Yucatan region. Within it, he portrayed temples exceeding cathedrals in height, settlements consumed by wilderness, and inhabitants whose celestial understanding appeared older than Scripture itself. The Vatican examined these accounts with fascination, yet also wariness. Initially, it seemed like another narrative from the New World. Unusual, certainly, but controllable. However, as missionaries ventured deeper into the rainforest, their reports to superiors grew increasingly troubling. Markings carved in stone that reflected Christian prophecies, rituals that coordinated with seasonal changes and lunar eclipses, and legends of deities who descended from above while promising return when stellar conditions aligned once more. In private chambers, Vatican transcribers compiled these testimonies, preserving them in concealed sections within the apostolic collection. A design was emerging. The Mayans didn't perceive time as linear progression. They understood history as circular, that conclusions were merely fresh starts. This was a temporal vision that resonated through revelation, patterns of reckoning, renewal, and illumination following shadow, and here the genuine uneasiness took root. One testimony from a Jesuit evangelist recorded in 1610 detailed a ceremony he observed near Lake Atitlan. He stated local priests had sketched the heavens with coal, creating a spiral nearly identical to one discovered in an obscure Christian manuscript housed beneath Vatican archives. That mark represented infinity, yet here it appeared thousands of miles distant among people who'd never encountered Christ's teachings. The similarity was too striking. Some church members interpreted it as evidence of hidden links. Others suspected deception, possibly even demonic influence. A gathering was convened to examine the discoveries. Records from that session exist today, though access remains limited. Within them, cardinals discussed whether to continue collecting Mayan documents or eliminate them completely. The ultimate choice was never documented. Only the cessation of subsequent reports suggests their decision. Yet not everything disappeared. One Mayan manuscript, retrieved from a deteriorating monastery wall in 1708, was discreetly transported to the Vatican. Enclosed in silk and preserved in crystal, it remains within the private forbidden collection, rarely discussed, never displayed publicly. From that point onward, the Vatican observed the South, not with fascination but with vigilance. Something had been witnessed, something too familiar, too close, and for the first time the Church confronted not a heathen history, but a reflection, a mirror that returned their gaze with star-shaped eyes. Within the Guatemalan jungle's depths, surrounded by vegetation and stillness, stone temple clusters reached skyward. They possessed no chimes, no coloured glass, no sacred symbols. Yet they shared tales older than most civilizations recalled. These weren't ruins to the Maya, they were stone calendars, prophetic tools, and when Vatican missionaries first ascended their stairs during the early 1600s, they didn't discover primitive beliefs. They discovered accuracy. The temples weren't randomly constructed. Each faced specific directions, followed shadows, or captured dawnlight at precise solstice moments. One temple, in present-day Tikal, was engineered so winter solstice's first beams would pass through a narrow gap, illuminating a carved serpent's head. This wasn't symbolism. This was measurement. When this intelligence reached the Vatican, it created quiet turmoil, not publicly, but among skywatchers. At the Vatican Observatory, several priests began rechecking stellar maps. Their findings disturbed them. The alignments weren't approximate, they were perfect. And certain Mayan temples reflected observations recently validated by European scientists. A specific Copan temple tracked Venus's path with error margins so minimal they seemed impossible. During that era, even Europe's finest astronomers were just beginning to comprehend planetary motion. Yet here it was. Limestone carved centuries before telescopes existed. Behind closed doors, a Lateran Palace meeting was scheduled. A question was posed quietly yet earnestly. How had people without metal implements, written language, or church guidance achieved such celestial knowledge? One cardinal allegedly answered with one word: remembrance. According to missionary records, Mayans believed they weren't discovering stars. They were recollecting them. They spoke of previous worlds, of vanished cycles, and of knowledge transmitted not through writing but through rhythm, via ceremony, song, and shadow. One Jesuit named Father Alvarez remained beyond his assignment. In correspondence dated 1624, he wrote that temples weren't temples whatsoever but devices. Each one communicates, he stated, not through sound, but through timing, through quiet and illumination. That letter was intercepted before reaching Spain. A duplicate went to the Congregation for the Doctrine of Faith. It was never referenced again. Yet whispers from those stone temples persist. They communicate through their construction. They resonate through every seasonal transition. Not loudly, not obviously. But if you understand how to hear, the voice remains. The puzzle isn't why temples were constructed. It's why they correspond so precisely with mysteries the Vatican once thought only it possessed. During summer 1562, Yucatan skies were thick with humidity. Smoke drifted from a Mani monastery courtyard where something unusual and permanent was occurring. The central figure was Bishop Diego de Landa, someone both celebrated and dreaded within Catholic circles. He dressed in devotional garments, yet his hands shook as he continuously fed flames with bark and ink pages. The fire devoured entire libraries of Mayan wisdom, books called codices, containing symbols, calendars, and narratives written long before Spanish arrival. There were melodies and charts, stellar records and prophecies extending thousands of years ahead. Everything became cinders during one extended afternoon. The Vatican never issued official commentary about the incident. Landa's behaviour wasn't publicly criticised nor completely endorsed. His documentation was processed, his discretion preserved, yet within certain apostolic archive sections his correspondence copies remain. They reveal a narrative far more complex than textbook versions. What most troubled Bishop Landa wasn't the people themselves. It was their beliefs. He had witnessed rituals mirroring Christian ceremonies but performed honouring gods with feathered features and serpentine eyes. He had observed calendars predicting empire rises and falls with unsettling accuracy. And in one concealed temple he claimed discovering a stone tablet carved with Christ's exact birth date. This moment transformed him. In his words, he feared evil had planted truth among pagans to challenge the Church. The Vatican, according to one preserved letter draft, required warning. Their understanding runs profound, and they claim remembering pre-stellar times. Such memory threatens safety. Landa burned codices not from anger, but from fear. Yet years afterward, long after his Spanish recall and quiet removal from missionary work, something remarkable happened. A delivery reached Rome under complete diplomatic protection. Inside were fragments, pieces of the very codices he'd claimed destroying, some charred, some damaged, some surprisingly whole. No record identifies the sender. No explanation was provided, but they were carefully placed in Vatican Library restricted holdings. Bishop Landa spent final years in quiet seclusion. He never again addressed the Mayans. He delivered no sermons, published no admissions. His silence became his monument. But for those walking Vatican archive corridors today, his name lingers, faintly carved on forbidden text shelves. What he feared might not have been Maya themselves. It may have been the possibility that the Church wasn't first to possess truth. Below the Apostolic Palace's polished marble, far from tourist and clergy observation, lies a corridor leading to an unnamed vault. Air grows colder there, time flows differently, and silence comes not from stillness, but from stories nobody may share. Here the Vatican preserves what it cannot comprehend: correspondence without authors, volumes without names, prophecies without solutions. In 1679, one such story reached Rome. It didn't arrive in any official package. Instead, it was smuggled within a routine delivery of colonial church documents from Spanish territories. Buried between marriage records and baptismal certificates lay a piece of aged parchment, cracked and brittle, bearing an unfamiliar seal. No formal header adorned it, just a title scrawled by an unsteady hand: "The Serpent Who Arrives with Sunday." The manuscript bore no signature, yet its contents would haunt Vatican corridors for generations. Within were detailed accounts of a Mayan ritual witnessed by a missionary near Uxmal. The writer had observed in secret. Dressed in local clothing, he described crowds assembled beneath a stone archway, watching dawn's light pass through the centre of a carved entrance. When the first rays appeared, worshippers knelt and spoke one name in unison: Kukulkan, the plumed serpent deity, who legend claimed would return when time's great cycle reached its end. What most disturbed the author wasn't the ceremony itself, it was the calendar marking that specific day. The Maya believed this event formed part of a countdown, one destined to conclude in 2012. The writer noted, "Their concept of time differs from ours. It moves in circles, and this circle approaches its end." The parchment disappeared quietly into a locked vault within the Apostolic Archive. Only select individuals gained access. Among them was Jesuit scholar Father Emilio Saudi Arabia, renowned for comparative theology work. Father Saudi began connecting this Mayan cycle with an enigmatic passage from the Book of Daniel. He suspected the Maya possessed fragments of truth lost to European Christianity during the Church's early centuries. He shared this theory with a single cardinal. Within days, Father Saudi found himself reassigned to an Alpine monastery, where he remained until death. He never published another word. The parchment endures. It carries no official number, no catalogue reference, stored in a velvet-lined drawer behind a panel requiring 3 keys. Only 2 keys are known to remain. The third, rumour suggests, vanished intentionally. What lies within that forgotten document isn't a warning. It poses a question, one that still echoes through Vatican domes and hallways. What if the end the Maya described was never meant to inspire fear but remembrance? During the early 1600s, Jesuits moved silently through Central America's dense jungles. They weren't conquerors, they carried no weapons. Their mission wasn't conquest but conversion. Yet as they walked beneath towering temple shadows and slept under alien constellations, their reports began shifting. These missionaries weren't merely describing pagan worship or native traditions. They documented sky gods, feathered beings of fire who promised return when certain temporal cycles completed. Father Matteo Sanz, a particular Jesuit trained in Vatican astronomy before colonial assignment, understood stellar movements and their Christian significance. Nothing prepared him for his 1614 discovery in a village near Palenque. There, locals revealed carved panels within a temple chamber that precisely charted planetary movements across centuries. Images showed rising and falling celestial flames, each followed by changes in leadership and seasons. One carving depicted a serpent descending from heaven, wrapped in smoke and light. Upon returning to his mission house, Father Matteo wrote not a standard report, but a confession. He admitted he could no longer dismiss Mayan beliefs as mere superstition. In his own words, their gods aren't pagan deities in the traditional sense. They are remembered visitors, waiting for the sky to speak once more. That letter was intercepted before leaving the colony. A copy reached the Vatican Observatory, where it was read aloud during a private gathering of astronomers and theologians. They debated deep into the night. Some believed the Maya had witnessed ancient comets or eclipses, transforming them into mythology. Others wondered if these sky gods represented something more. The debate remained unresolved. 2 weeks later, new instructions reached Jesuit missions throughout the Americas. All future references to sky beings were to be eliminated from reports. Priests received orders to substitute such terms with astral deities or pagan symbols. Truth, it seemed, was too dangerous for plain documentation. Still, some accounts survived. In a Seville monastery vault, a hidden diary from Jesuit Brother Alonso records a 1639 dream. He envisioned St. Peter's Basilica dome opening like a flower, from which descended a feathered golden figure holding a calendar blazing like fire. The entry concludes with one sentence: "They don't worship stars. They remember their origins." The Vatican never acknowledged Brother Alonso's account. His diary was later transferred without explanation to the secret archives, where it vanished forever. It started with what the Vatican considered an error. In 1670, Jesuit mathematician Father Lorenzo Bruni returned to Rome after 5 years among Chiapas Maya. He brought no relics, no idols, no statues. Instead, he carried hand-copied charts drawn from temple walls and bark paper codices. To untrained observers, they appeared merely decorative, but Father Bruni recognized something different: numbers, ratios, cycles. The Mayan calendar was already familiar to some Vatican scholars. It had been dismissed as primitive, an early timekeeping attempt. As Bruni presented his findings in the quiet, candle-lit Vatican observatory chambers, the atmosphere transformed. These weren't random dates or crude estimations. These were mathematical calculations predicting solar and lunar eclipses with stunning precision, not just present events, but centuries past and future. One chart perfectly aligned with a 684 eclipse long before Galileo's birth. Another matched an 1091 eclipse, centuries after the calendar's stone carving. Father Bruni offered no explanation. He could only state that the Maya understood the heavens far better than anticipated. The Church's concern transcended the science. It was the underlying question. How had an ancient civilization, lacking telescopes or European knowledge, charted stars so precisely? More importantly, why did their calendar terminate on such a specific date? December 21st, 2012. Cardinal Anselmo de Rossi, a cautious theologian never quick to embrace myth or miracle, reviewed the charts personally. After weeks of study, he requested a papal audience. The meeting's content remains unknown. No transcript exists. Afterward, all copies of Bruni's charts received restricted classification, and Bruni himself was reassigned to rural Sicily. The only remaining clue was a margin note in Cardinal Anselmo's private journal. If this calendar proves accurate, then either they perceived farther than we ever imagined, or someone demonstrated how. That sentence was never intended for public eyes, but in 1963, during a Vatican library renovation, a young archivist unknowingly included it in a routine report. The next morning, he was transferred to a remote Brazilian parish. The journal disappeared from the archive that same week. Today, the Mayan calendar is studied in schools and museums. It's explained as myth, culture, clever observation. But in the Vatican's deeper chambers, where stone walls meet silence, it's remembered as something else entirely. A calendar too precise to dismiss, too ancient to ignore, and perhaps too true to discuss openly. It was called the most complete of all Mayan texts, a codex untouched by flames, unbroken by time. Scholars named it the Codex of Shadows, though its true name was never recorded. Only a few people in history had witnessed it firsthand, and fewer still would speak of it, because the last time it was mentioned, it vanished without trace en route to Rome. The year was 1681. Jesuit priest Father Ignacio Morales had spent over a decade in the Yucatan, working quietly among Mayan elders. He wasn't interested in conversion. He was a linguist, a listener. He had earned trust not through preaching but through learning. When they finally revealed the codex hidden beneath a stone slab in a collapsed temple, he wept. The pages were thick bark, folded accordion style. Painted in red, black and gold, it told not only divine stories but stellar movements, the arrival of overseas strangers, and a final alignment yet to occur in the distant future. December 21st, 2012. Father Ignacio knew this text would never be permitted in the colonies. He copied it by hand, word for word, line by line. When the time was right, he prepared a sealed shipment addressed to the Vatican Library, marked for Cardinal Bellini, a powerful Jesuit supporter. The codex never arrived. Some claim the carrying ship was lost at sea, caught in a Portuguese coast storm. Others believe rival missionaries intercepted it, fearing its contents. One whispered rumour, circulated through a Salamanca Jesuit college, claimed the codex did reach Rome, but was confiscated by the Congregation for the Doctrine of the Faith before opening. No official record exists in the Vatican Library catalogue, but in a forgotten 1682 ledger, a single line appears under incoming artefacts. One parcel, contents unknown, locked by cardinal order. The signature is faded, ink smudged, but the code beside the entry, Viescas YC21, matches a shelf in an archive that no longer exists. That room was sealed during early 19th century collection restructuring. The given reason was fire damage, but no fire was ever recorded. Today, only codex fragments are known to survive. A single page, briefly displayed in a Florence museum in 1941, was removed after 3 days. Visitors claimed the page's symbols seemed to shift in light. The Vatican has never confirmed the codex's existence. But for those who study stars and ancient Mayan calendar voices, its absence speaks louder than any record, because sometimes what disappears tells the most dangerous story of all. In autumn 1692, a candlelit chamber deep within the Holy Office Palace filled with rustling papers and uneasy robe movements. The Roman Inquisition, centuries-long silent guardian of church doctrine, had called a closed-door briefing. The matter wasn't European heresy. It came from across the ocean, deep within New World jungles. The report was written by a Dominican friar stationed near Guatemala's highlands. What he described was unlike anything the Inquisition had previously encountered. It wasn't witchcraft, blasphemy, or open rebellion. Instead, he warned of what he termed cyclical time cults, local belief systems built around history, moving in circles rather than lines. At first glance, this might have seemed harmless, but as the briefing progressed, the friar's message proved far more troubling. These Mayan communities weren't merely preserving ancient stories. They were following precise calendars, performing rituals at exact astronomical moments, and predicting events with disturbing accuracy. They believed time didn't progress but repeated, that empire rises and falls, Messiah births, even great floods and fires had all occurred before and would occur again. What most disturbed the inquisitors wasn't the theology, it was the symmetry. One line from the friar's report stood above all others. Their cycle ends when ours begins, and begins again when ours ends, as though the same hand winds both clocks. The idea that another belief system could mirror Christian prophecy in such detail demanded serious attention. In response, a directive was drafted to all American clergy. It ordered immediate confiscation of all native calendars, ritual tools, and undestroyed codices. Priests received instructions to question those speaking of the returning sun or the sleeping serpent. Privately, a second document was prepared, marked with red wax seal, addressed directly to the Vatican Apostolic Archive. That second document, labelled Manuscript TVX-12, remains sealed today. Some claim it includes drawings of carved Mayan altars showing solar eclipses paired with biblical dates. Others say it references Ecclesiastes, where time is described not as progress but repetition. No one knows for certain because the manuscript has never been made public. The Inquisition never issued public warnings. There were no trials, no burning stakes, only silence. The kind of silence that lives in stone vaults and sealed rooms, where candles burn low and records rest in careful hands. The Church knew how to silence voices, but this time it dealt with echoes. echoes of a calendar predicting more than dates, echoes of a prophecy the Vatican could neither prove nor dismiss. In quiet Vatican library corners where light falls soft and golden through narrow windows, there are uncatalogued shelves in rooms absent from any public map. This isn't the grand reading hall known to scholars and students. This is deeper, quieter. In one such room, it's said, rests a single cedar wood box tied with faded red ribbon, labelled only with a date. The story begins in 1711, when a visiting Jesuit returned from the Yucatan with more than letters or sketches. Hidden within his belongings was a folded manuscript, blackened around edges, as if rescued from fire. According to his journal, it was saved from monastery ruins where Mayan scribes once kept forbidden records. The priest, Father Esteban Ruiz, claimed the text had been buried in clay for protection from destruction. What he carried back wasn't complete. It was a single fragment. But what remained was enough to disturb several Vatican officials' peace. The document had been secretly translated by Father Ruiz himself. It spoke of a coming age, marked by midday darkness, when the serpent would rise again, not in flesh, but as fire that walks. This prophecy, unlike others, included a specific date, not a vague era or symbolic century, but clear, deliberate marking, December 24, 2012. Father Ruiz submitted the translation to the Vatican Library, where it was quietly reviewed and stored. Only a few men were allowed to see it, but as decades passed, whispers grew. Archivists began speaking of a sun prophecy buried in the collection. Young training priests claimed they glimpsed it once, opened on a desk under glass, glowing faintly under candlelight. One man, Father Angelo Cortese, wrote in his 1864 private diary, "The Mayan page is real. I have seen it with my own eyes. The symbols match nothing in our script, yet I understood them not in words, but in meaning. They spoke not of death, but of remembering." Shortly after that entry, Father Cortese was transferred to archives beneath St. Peter's Basilica. He never wrote again. The cedar wood box hasn't been opened in over a century, not because it's forgotten, but because of unspoken understanding. Those who know of it agree it's safer unread. Some secrets are kept not to deceive, but to delay until the world is ready, yet every few years, someone new requests to view the collection. A name appears on the request list, a door opens, a footstep echoes through a corridor where dust doesn't gather. In the Vatican Library, even silence has memory. Some whispers never fade. Not when they carry time's weight. Not when they speak of one world's end and another's quiet beginning. It wasn't Rome's fall that startled the Church. It was the feeling they had witnessed it before. Centuries after the Western Roman Empire collapsed under its own ambition's weight, a quiet reflection lingered in Vatican stone walls. The year was 576, and the city lay battered by time, war, and memory. The once mighty empire had become a patchwork of ruins and silence. Within the church, something older stirred. A realization that empire falls might not be warnings, but patterns. Years later, when Vatican scholars began reading translated Mayan prophecy fragments, they found something deeply unsettling. The Maya had their own collapse. Their cities, massive, vibrant, knowledge-filled, vanished into jungle, swallowed by vines and mystery. Their temples fell quiet. Their roads were abandoned, yet their stories endured. Etched into stone and recorded in codices were tales not of defeat, but of cycles. The Maya believed destruction wasn't world's end, but one chapter's conclusion in a greater rhythm. This concept mirrored something deeply familiar to the Vatican. Within Christian teachings, particularly Revelation, time isn't straight. It folds, it loops, it brings forth judgment only to offer rebirth. So when a missionary in 1693 returned from the Payton region with a stone rubbing of Mayan carving, Vatican theologians couldn't look away. The carving depicted a serpent devouring its own tail, a symbol used not only by Maya but also appearing centuries earlier in Christian alchemical texts. More haunting still, the carving included dates that, when converted, marked events eerily close to Rome's fall, the Great Schism, and even the Black Death. One Jesuit, Father Alberto Grimani, made the connection openly. In a letter preserved in the Vatican secret archive, he wrote, "We are not the first to fall, and if their cycle speaks truth, we shall not be the last." His words were considered dangerous not because they contradicted church teaching, but because they echoed it too clearly. What troubled his superiors most was the possibility that the Maya, far removed from Europe, had described not only their own collapse but everyone's. If Rome had fallen and the Maya had fallen, then what force guided both? This question grew louder behind Vatican doors but never reached the public. Documents were sealed, symbols were retranslated, the serpent was renamed. But the fear remained, because buried deep in both Mayan prophecy and Christian scripture was the same shadow, a warning that time doesn't end, it turns. When it turns again, the Vatican will remember fallen temples' silence, forgotten streets' dust, and the haunting echo of a pattern that cannot be stopped, only survived. It was just after sunset in Guatemala's highlands in 1631 when the sky turned blood red. Jesuit missionary Father Domingo Ortega recorded it in his travel diary, writing by lantern light inside a crumbling stone chapel. He had been stationed near a Mayan village where he was tasked with teaching scripture. The locals were reluctant listeners. They had their own stories, their own gods. What disturbed Father Ortega most? Their own sense of time. That evening, as he prepared for evening prayer, strange silence settled over the valley. Birds stopped singing, air grew still. Then the sky lit up in deep red glow that didn't fade. Villagers gathered in the clearing, whispering in low tones. No one cried out, no one fled. They simply stared, as if they had been expecting this. It wasn't lightning, it wasn't fire. Red glow spread across the horizon, followed by a rising full moon, darkened and tinted the same crimson hue. A total lunar eclipse. What startled Father Ortega wasn't the event itself. It was how calm the villagers were, as if they knew it was coming. Later that night, he approached the village elder and asked what they had witnessed. The old man replied softly, "This is the serpent's breath. It comes before each turning of the Sunday." Father Ortega didn't understand the meaning, but the elder invited him to see something. Next day at dawn, they walked deep into the forest to a small temple carved into a cliffside. There, on a wall blackened with moss and age, was a carving of a sky filled with red, a moon covered in shadow, and beneath it, a serpent with fire wings coiled in a circle. Father Ortega sketched the carving and included it with his next report to Rome. Months later, he received a reply, not from his mission field superiors, but directly from a Vatican observatory clerk. The letter instructed him to observe any further lunar events and report specific dates and times with maximum detail. Nothing else was said, but according to records stored in the Vatican Apostolic Archive, that particular lunar eclipse had occurred during the same week as a rare solar alignment seen only once every 260 years. The Mayan calendar had marked that date centuries earlier. In his final journal margins, Father Ortega wrote, "They do not fear the sky. They listen to it, and somehow it listens back." The carving he sketched was never returned. The village he lived in no longer appears on maps, and the chapel where he last wrote his thoughts is now nothing more than a moss-covered ruin. But in Vatican-sealed rooms, his letters remain. Because that red sky wasn't just a sign, it was a reminder that prophecy in some places is written not in books, but in light. In spring 1724, Spanish astronomer Alonso Garrido stepped off a weathered ship in Veracruz port. He was a quiet man, well known within Madrid scientific circles and even better known by select Vatican scholars. His work with the Royal Observatory had earned cardinal respect from those who studied stars not as myth, but as signs. Garrido wasn't a missionary. He hadn't come to convert. He had come to observe. His official task was assisting the Church in understanding local calendars used by native populations. What he found in southern Mexico jungles would shake his faith's foundations and lead to a confession the Vatican was never prepared to receive. Garrido spent nearly 2 years living among Maya near Izamal ruins. He carried books, charts and star maps. He brought the day's best instruments, made by craftsmen in Rome and Toledo. When he compared his data with temple alignments and carved star charts of the Maya, he discovered something unsettling. Their records were more accurate. At first he dismissed it as coincidence. Stars, after all, were the same in every sky. But slowly he began noticing something deeper. The Maya weren't simply tracking light, they were predicting it. Eclipses, solstices, planetary alignments with a precision that European science had only just begun to reach. One evening during the equinox, Garrido stood atop a stepped pyramid. As the sun passed directly through its central corridor, light struck a single carved glyph, one that, according to his Mayan interpreter, translated as the return. When Garrido asked what it meant, the interpreter simply said, "It is when the sky remembers what it showed before." By the winter months of 1726, Garrido had ceased his regular communications with Spain. His correspondence transformed from scholarly reports to intimate confessions. In what would become his last message, penned with an unsteady hand and directed not to the Royal Observatory, but straight to Vatican officials, he revealed something extraordinary. He confessed that he no longer believed they were educating these people. Instead, he suspected they were recalling knowledge these civilizations had never lost. Perhaps their deities were identical to Christian ones, simply viewed through the lens of another era. Their concept of time wasn't linear, neither future nor past. It functioned like a reflection, and he feared he had been observing from the incorrect perspective. This correspondence reached Rome during the summer of 1727. It received no response. Shortly after, Garrido vanished completely. No evidence remained. His possessions, still occupying a rented chamber near the mission compound, were secured and transported to Vatican archives. His personal writings accompanied them. However, according to confidential documentation housed within the secret collections, certain pages had been extracted before delivery. These described something he witnessed during a lunar eclipse, Earth's shadow crossing the moon's surface, and within its boundary a form he couldn't interpret. He had written simply that it observed him in return, then he disappeared forever. During 1792, Rome experienced unusual tranquility. The French Revolution had disrupted Europe, leaving papal authorities anxious. Yet within Vatican walls, another kind of unrest was developing, not from warfare, but from visions. Pope Pius VI approached the final years of his lengthy papacy. Though aged and weakened by political struggles and poor health, his intellect remained keen. His inner circle noticed a peculiar behaviour. He had abandoned sleeping through entire nights. Each dawn, just before daybreak, he would emerge from his chambers, ashen and disturbed. His attendants reported he would remain motionless beside windows overlooking St. Peter's Square, murmuring Latin phrases they couldn't decipher. Then, the sketches appeared. Initially just minor doodles in letter margins, jagged strokes, creature forms, unusual suns with feather-like rays. His aide, Cardinal Giraud, attributed this to advancing age or fatigue. But eventually a complete illustration materialized on the Pope's desk. It depicted a figure in ritual garments, crowned with a jaguar headdress, positioned beneath St. Peter's dome. Its meaning remained unclear. The Holy Father never discussed this image publicly, yet a private notation discovered later in Vatican records stated that this figure occupied the central position, though he didn't belong to their faith. He had waited, previously. He continues waiting. Around this period, the Vatican Library quietly received shipments from Jesuit missions throughout Central America. These contained materials recovered from ancient Mayan sites, sculptures, astronomical charts, fragments of supposedly destroyed manuscripts. Among these was a panel carved with imagery nearly matching the Pope's drawing. A priest wearing jaguar hide, standing beneath star-filled heavens, grasping a staff pointed toward dawn. Cardinal Giraud, troubled by this similarity, ordered both the sketch and carving secured in the Apostolic Archives restricted section. Nonetheless, whispers circulated. Some suggested the Pope had experienced visions, not through sight, but through dreams. One evening before his 1799 death, the Pope reportedly awakened in terror. Guards discovered him prostrate in his private chapel, fixated on the crucifix. He spoke only once before collapsing. The jungle deities never slumber. They remember us. Following his passing, personal belongings were collected and sealed away. Most remain concealed. The drawing was never exhibited. The carved panel vanished from archives within 10 years. Still, in Vatican's deeper corridors, his name continues generating unease, not for public statements, but for nocturnal visions. Not every prophecy appears in Scripture. Some moves silently through consciousness, adorned with plumes, bearing a jaguar's visage. On a stormy afternoon in 1835, young Vatican researcher Father Giulio Neri discovered something extraordinary. While examining forgotten theological manuscripts in the archives, he found a small scroll hidden within an ancient prayer book. This scroll wasn't written in Latin. It contained Mayan hieroglyphs. Beneath them, careful handwriting provided Latin translations by some forgotten cleric. The translation read that when the 13th Baktun concludes, the world would face judgment again. Initially, Father Neri couldn't grasp its significance, but comparing the scroll's dates with Christian chronology revealed something disturbing. The Mayan long-count calendar didn't simply track time, it predicted major transformations. One date aligned with Jerusalem's Second Temple destruction, another matched Christ's crucifixion year. This seemed impossible, yet patterns continued. As Neri investigated further, another troubling alignment emerged. The Mayan date for their current cycle's end, December 21st, 2012, fell precisely during Advent, when Catholics await Christ's return. This symbolism was unmistakable. He compiled a report for the Congregation for the Doctrine of the Faith. Rather than silence, he received a summons. In a shadowy chamber near St. Peter's Basilica, Father Neri presented discoveries to senior clerics. He explained how Mayans perceived time as cyclical rather than linear, believing ages ended and renewed, speaking of a celestial figure returning to bring restoration. His final proposition: what if their apocalyptic vision represented resurrection rather than destruction? Extended silence followed. Finally, one cardinal responded, "You're suggesting their prophecy mirrors ours." Father Neri agreed. Another cardinal grimly added, "Or worse, that ours mirrors theirs." The scroll was confiscated and classified as restricted. Neri was instructed never to discuss it again. Yet in private journals, he wrote that he believed this wasn't coincidental. The cross and calendar spoke different languages, but told identical stories. Years later, the scroll disappeared from archives. But journals remained, concealed beneath loose floorboards in the scholar's former study. They were accidentally discovered during 1972 renovations. Mayan symbols remained visible. Beside them, Neri had sketched a simple image: a Christian cross perfectly centered within a Mayan sunwheel. Vatican officials never commented, but in quiet historical spaces, some still wonder whether the cross and calendar were never opposing forces, but always components of the same prophecy. It arrived wrapped in ash-coloured fabric, bound with twisted leather cord. The year was 1842. A Yucatan missionary had shipped it to Rome without accompanying letter, instructions, or identification, only a small note attached to the wrapping. It reflects what shouldn't be seen. In Vatican's receiving chamber, Brother Thomas carefully unwrapped the package. Inside was a circular obsidian mirror so dark it seemed to absorb surrounding light. It was substantial, with carved Mayan glyphs encircling its perimeter like a sundial. No visible flaws, cracks, or dust marked its surface, as though freshly crafted. Yet it was centuries old. Initially considered ceremonial, a relic the church often collected and quietly stored, the mirror was placed in a secure chamber near Vatican Library. But strange occurrences began immediately. Chamber guards reported persistent uneasiness. Some claimed to hear faint whispers from empty rooms. One priest swore the mirror's surface rippled when he passed with candlelight. Then Father Matteo Fiorenzi, the assigned archivist, began changing. Father Fiorenzi was methodical, known for precise documentation and calm demeanour. But after just 3 days with the mirror, he stopped speaking entirely. He spent hours alone with the object in complete silence. When superiors requested reports, he submitted a single page, repeating one Latin phrase, "Non est speculum est ostium." It is not a mirror, it is a door. The page was confiscated. Father Fiorenzi was relocated to an alpine monastery for recovery. Before departing, he shared something disturbing with a colleague. The mirror had shown him a vine-covered temple beneath skies filled with unfamiliar stars. Within stood a faceless figure holding both sun and cross. The mirror was immediately sealed in lead-lined containers and stored beneath Vatican Library in sections reserved for items too dangerous to destroy yet too mysterious to display. It hasn't been viewed since, but in forgotten catalogue margins, tucked behind broken shelving, remains one final note from the archivist before his silence. It doesn't reflect the observer, it reflects the moment following them. So it remains, hidden beneath marble and memory, deep within Vatican shadows. A forbidden mirror, not for what it reveals, but for what it remembers. In 1780, Franciscan friar Brother Miguel de Avila returned from Chiapas hills carrying an unprecedented manuscript, worn, fragile, and wrapped in deer hide. Reportedly copied from temple walls by a Mayan elder before his death, the friar, visibly shaken, delivered it directly to Vatican's colonial representative, insisting it contained prophecies so ancient and precise they couldn't be of human origin. The document described 9 hells, not Christian fire and brimstone, but 9 distinct decline periods, each marked by suffering, chaos, or collapse. According to Mayan beliefs, each hell lasted 52 years. The 9th and final hell supposedly began in 1516, precisely when Hernán Cortés reached New World shores. Vatican officials, already suspicious of Mayan cosmology, took keen interest, not for cultural significance, but because it aligned too perfectly with events the Church had secretly studied. Each hell bore a symbol. One showed a burning tower, another a weeping sun. The 6th depicted a red-robed figure kneeling before a stone serpent. The 8th remained blank, as if awaiting revelation. But the 9th, final era, displayed a symbol Vatican couldn't ignore, a cross split down the middle, surrounded by flame circles. Cardinal Mancini, leading Vatican's historical commission, made initial connections. He noted the 9th hell's beginning date not only matched Spanish arrival in America, but also coincided with rising apocalyptic sermons throughout Europe, talk of comets, eclipses, famines, and prophecies found not in scripture, but in celestial signs. He believed 9 hells weren't exclusively Mayan concepts, but part of something older, shared, perhaps forgotten. He feared the cracked cross warned not just America, but Rome itself. When Vatican scholars examined the prophecy closely, another detail surfaced. The 9 hells' total span, 468 years, ended on a chillingly familiar date, December 21st, 2012. The Church never published Brother Miguel's manuscript. It was filed in restricted storage labelled only with Roman numerals, and the phrase Finis Novae Lucis, the end of new light. Those who read it began calling the prophecy by another name, the clock beneath the altar. Because if accurate, time wasn't just moving forward, it was counting down. And within Vatican walls, behind closed doors, some questioned aloud what follows the ninth hell, and what, if anything, survives the ensuing silence. In 1678, Jesuit cartographer Father Alonso Vergara completed an extraordinary map. Drawn on fine vellum with gold leaf borders and signed with Society of Jesus emblems, it initially appeared to be a standard New World chart, spanning from South America's tip to northern Mexico's distant peaks. But when the map reached Vatican, carefully rolled in a lacquered case, it wasn't filed with other geographical documents. It was sent to apostolic archives. Something was wrong. Father Vergara had trained in Rome. He understood astronomy, seasons, and navigation science. He had spent over 10 years travelling on foot and by canoe through Central America, consulting local villagers, visiting ruined temples, measuring distances. His maps were trusted by both church and crown. But this final work, completed before his mysterious disappearance, told a different story. Scattered across the page, among mountains and forests, were small red symbols. Vatican officials initially assumed they marked Jesuit missions, but someone noticed none of these symbols corresponded to any known church sites. They weren't cities or settlements. They were all abandoned temple locations, Mayan, Mixtec, and Olmec ruins, long forgotten. Each red mark formed a pattern. When a Vatican astronomer compared the layout to star charts, the connection became undeniable. The marks aligned with constellations, specifically those visible only in the southern hemisphere during solstice events. One symbol over Köpen matched the Southern Cross shape. Another near Palenque mirrored Venus's 8-year celestial path. But the most disturbing alignment was this. The pattern's heart, the centre of all red symbols, landed precisely on Chichen Itza. Directly beside that red mark, written in fine Latin script, was a phrase causing immediate Vatican alarm. Lux venit per circulum. The light returns through the circle. Father Vergara hadn't simply mapped territory, he had mapped prophecy. Vatican held emergency reviews. Theologians, astronomers and historians studied the pattern. Some believed it offered understanding, others feared it conveyed messages the Church was never meant to receive. When his notes were requested, none existed. The cartographer's journals had vanished. His final known letter to a fellow Jesuit in Seville contained only, "The land remembers the sky." That map remains sealed in Vatican today, kept under glass in chambers where no light is permitted to touch it. Some claim if you overlay star charts under red light, new patterns emerge. Others believe it was simply a warning, that even Earth, when forgotten, will eventually speak through its most ancient forms. And Vatican, despite all its marble and memory, still listens. Because sometimes truth isn't hidden in books, it's drawn into maps, waiting for someone to see what stars have always known. In Vatican City's heart, behind iron gates and shadowed by tall cypresses, lies a quiet burial ground called the Teutonic Cemetery. Reserved for German-speaking clergy and nobles, it's a peaceful place few consider. But beneath its soil, hidden by time and silence, rests a secret Vatican has never publicly acknowledged. It began in 1929. During foundation reinforcement renovations, workers clearing debris near the old chapel wall struck stone that didn't belong there. Beneath soft earth lay a carved lid, flat, rectangular, sealed with iron clasps. Vatican ordered work suspended. A team of trusted clerics and archivists arrived by candlelight that evening. The stone container was carefully lifted and brought into underground crypts. Inside was an object wrapped in faded cloth, tied with a single red cord. When unwrapped, the men stood speechless. It was a disc no larger than a dinner plate, crafted from dark green jade. At its centre was a spiral etched with strange symbols, neither Latin nor Greek. A small note written in careful Italian was placed beneath. Taken from the well at Chichen Itza. Keep it where the sun cannot reach. No official records existed of Vatican missions to Chichen Itza. No signature appeared on the note, but someone had transported this object across oceans, not as treasure, but as warning. The jade disc was transferred to the Congregation for the Doctrine of the Faith. A confidential report was prepared and secured. Only Monsignor Paolo Ferraro continued researching it. He realized the disc's spiral wasn't merely symbolic. It was a calendar ending on an unforgettable date, December 21st, 2012. But the date wasn't what disturbed him most. It was how the calendar ended. The spiral didn't simply stop. It folded inward, as though time collapsed upon itself. Beneath the final glyph was a shape he recognized from Christian texts, the serpent consuming its tail, the ancient symbol of eternal return. Monsignor Ferraro believed the artifact wasn't buried accidentally. It was deliberately hidden. The Teutonic cemetery, with guarded gates and sacred ground, was perfect for letting it sleep. He attempted presenting findings to higher officials, but within weeks was reassigned to a remote southern Italian post. He never returned to Rome. The jade disc remains beneath Vatican, in a chamber no longer appearing on official maps. The red cord still rests beside it, undisturbed. Above, in the cemetery's still air, cypress trees sway gently, unaware of what sleeps beneath them. Or perhaps they remember, because some secrets aren't buried, they're planted. And they wait to rise. During autumn 1582, St. Peter's Basilica bells rang low under grey Roman skies. Inside Vatican, Pope Gregory XIII sat alone in his study, examining charts, scrolls and star maps spanning centuries. He wasn't preparing sermons or writing decrees. He was reviewing time itself. For years, the Church knew the Julian calendar used throughout Christendom was drifting from solar alignment. The spring equinox, once observed March 21st, had begun arriving progressively earlier. The date was slipping, pulling feasts and holy days from their proper seasons. But what alarmed Pope Gregory most wasn't Easter's movement, it was what accompanied it. A whisper. Reports reached Vatican from Jesuit missionaries abroad. In Mexico and Guatemala, within vine-wrapped temples and silence, priests had discovered stone-carved calendars older and more precise than their own. These Mayan calendars didn't drift or falter. They turned like great wheels, aligning exactly with sun, moon and stars. One codex, translated by a friar and quietly transmitted to Rome, claimed time itself was circular and that ages ended not in destruction, but in rebirth. The documents arrived bearing dates that echoed pivotal moments in Christian tradition. Pope Gregory never mentioned this material publicly, yet weeks afterward he declared the most radical transformation to timekeeping the Church had ever attempted. 10 days would vanish. The calendar would leap ahead to align Easter with celestial movements. He called it essential correction, though whispers behind closed doors suggested deeper motivations. In a personal note discovered centuries later among his private correspondence, Pope Gregory had written, "To allow time to drift is to permit prophecy to proceed unchallenged. What has been calculated, we must suppress." The reformed system, later called the Gregorian calendar, found swift acceptance. Most viewed it as scientific progress, but one Jesuit posted in the Yucatan perceived it differently. His hidden records stated, "The Church has not corrected time, it has concealed itself from time." Shortly after this reform, the original Mayan manuscripts delivered to the Vatican disappeared from archive records. The monk who interpreted them was relocated to an isolated outpost and vanished without trace. Pope Gregory himself ceased all private letters concerning calendars or celestial studies. Through his remaining papal years, he spoke solely of Christ, never again of stellar matters. Yet in his private chamber's depths, he maintained one object on his writing desk. A stone fragment brought from the New World, depicting one wheel rotating within another, bearing a single Latin inscription beneath, Tempus redibit, time shall return. And with that return, perhaps, the knowledge he sought to conceal. Beneath silence and starlight, in an unmarked side chamber of the Vatican Library, beyond the gleaming corridors and watched passages, sits a drawer without identification. Within rests a manuscript wrapped in worn leather, its pages aged golden through centuries. It holds research rarely examined, an inquiry by Dominican priest Father Luca Severini, composed in the early 17th century. The title seems unusual for Christian scholarship, De Serpente Geminato, the double serpent. Father Severini had laboured 12 years in New Spain, tasked with native conversion. Yet his focus rapidly shifted from sacraments to iconography. A single image surfaced repeatedly, etched into sacred walls and painted on vessels. An immense feathered serpent ascending from ground to heavens. The inhabitants named him Kukulkan, or Quetzalcoatl, the plumed serpent. He represented no evil or beast. He embodied wisdom, compassion, illumination, and rebirth. He delivered understanding, disappeared without explanation, and would reportedly return at the destined moment. Upon Father Severini's return to Rome, he was transformed. He no longer viewed the Mayan civilization as wandering spirits. He recognized them as guardians of ancient truth. Within his writings, he presented a radical assertion. The feathered serpent transcended local worship, serving as reflection of another serpent, the one from Eden. Not Satan, he contended, but the authentic serpent, the original instructor. In Genesis, the serpent offers Eve wisdom. In Mayan lore, Quetzalcoatl grants humanity speech, timekeeping, and stellar comprehension. Both face punishment for their gifts, both suffer banishment. Father Severini's premise was elegant, yet perilous. He believed the Eden serpent and the feathered serpent were not adversaries. They were identical. And perhaps Eden's narrative had been misinterpreted. The Vatican rejected this. His manuscript was discreetly archived. He was transferred to a northern Italian monastery, dying just 3 years later, but his scholarship survived. One academic, an archive assistant, secretly copied it within another theological volume. That duplicate surfaced in 1944, amid World War II's upheaval. It reached a young cardinal named Vincenzo Bellini, who studied it with quiet wonder. Later, he would note in confidential correspondence, if Severini's claims hold truth, then the serpent might not be our adversary, he might be our remembrance. That letter remains locked in Vatican private collections. Yet throughout carved stones of lost temples and stained glass of ancient sanctuaries, the serpent image recurs endlessly, sometimes ascending, sometimes descending, perpetually observing. And perhaps this mystery the Church could never completely eliminate, that the serpent never fell from favour. He returned to the stars and waits still for when his dual narratives unite. In an unmarked side chamber of the Vatican Library, beyond the gleaming corridors and watched passages, sits a drawer without identification. Within rests a manuscript wrapped in worn leather with pages aged golden through centuries, containing research rarely examined, an inquiry by Dominican priest Father Luca Severini. Written in the early 17th century, the title seems unusual for Christian scholarship. De Serpente Geminato, the double serpent. Father Severini had laboured 12 years in New Spain, tasked with native conversion. Yet his focus rapidly shifted from sacraments to iconography. A single image surfaced repeatedly, etched into sacred walls and painted on vessels. An immense feathered serpent ascending from ground to heavens. The inhabitants named him Kukulkan, or Quetzalcoatl, the plumed serpent. He represented no evil or beast. He embodied wisdom, illumination, and rebirth. He delivered understanding, disappeared without explanation, and would reportedly return at the destined moment. Upon Father Severini's return to Rome, he was transformed. He no longer viewed the Mayan civilization as wandering spirits. He recognized them as guardians of ancient truth. Within his writings, he presented a radical assertion. The feathered serpent transcended local worship, serving as reflection of another serpent, the one from Eden. Not Satan, he contended, but the authentic serpent, the original instructor. In Genesis, the serpent offers Eve wisdom. In Mayan lore, Quetzalcoatl grants humanity speech, timekeeping, and stellar comprehension. Both face punishment for their gifts. Both suffer banishment. Father Severini's premise was elegant, yet perilous. He believed the Eden serpent and the feathered serpent were not adversaries. They were identical, and perhaps Eden's narrative had been misinterpreted. The Vatican rejected this. His manuscript was discreetly archived. He was transferred to a northern Italian monastery, dying just 3 years later, but his scholarship survived. One academic, an archive assistant, secretly copied it within another theological volume. That duplicate surfaced in 1944 amid World War II's upheaval. It reached a young cardinal named Vincenzo Bellini, who studied it with quiet wonder. Later, he would note in confidential correspondence, if Severini's claims hold truth, then the serpent might not be our adversary. He might be our remembrance. That letter remains locked in Vatican private collections. Yet throughout carved stones of lost temples and stained glass of ancient sanctuaries, the serpent image recurs endlessly, sometimes ascending, sometimes descending, perpetually observing. And perhaps this mystery the Church could never completely eliminate, that the serpent never fell from favour. He returned to the stars and waits still for when his dual narratives unite. In the year 1976, within a hushed hall of the Vatican Observatory, a young astronomer named Sister Luisa Ferrante discovered something beyond her assignment. She had been reviewing ancient celestial charts gathered by missionaries during colonial expansion. Most contained rough stellar sketches from the Andes, moonlight drawings made by flickering candles. Yet one scroll, wrapped in soft deer hide and marked in Latin as Orbis Ignotus, differed completely. When she unfurled it beneath her workspace lamp, she witnessed something both mystifying and magnificent. It displayed a star chart certainly, but followed no conventional pattern. Rather than a flat sky with scattered formations, it portrayed the heavens as a spiral curving inward, as though time and space folded toward a central point. Surrounding that spiral were markings, Mayan symbols, inscribed so precisely they required someone deeply versed in their meaning. At the spiral's heart lay a shape Sister Luisa recognized immediately. It was St. Peter's Basilica dome. Initially she assumed error, perhaps artistic license or design coincidence. Yet when she compared the map's stellar positions with actual celestial records, she discovered something disturbing. St. Peter's Dome, when observed directly overhead, mirrored the star arrangement visible above the Yucatan Peninsula during Mayan winter solstice. She presented the map to her supervisor, a gentle Jesuit named Father Armano. He examined it extensively and remained silent. The following day, the scroll had vanished. Sister Luisa learned of her reassignment to Milan. No explanation was provided, no inquiries permitted. Yet, she had duplicated the map before surrendering it. In her personal diary, she recorded a single observation. The sky above Rome is not our only celestial guide. Decades afterward, in a private Vatican gathering, a researcher referenced the identical map during a discreet presentation on architecture and astronomy. He proposed that St. Peter's Basilica was constructed not merely to honour heaven, but to mirror it, not Christianity's heaven, but an older one, a sky remembered by different people from another continent. The attending cardinal concluded the presentation without comment. The scholar's archive privileges were quietly withdrawn. Yet the drawing remained in his possession, hidden within a volume of Dante's Paradiso. It is claimed that overlaying the Mayan codices star map with the Vatican dome's design reveals stellar alignment not just around it, but through it. A pathway, a message, a chart not of space, but of time. And perhaps, just perhaps, that was the mystery throughout. The Church inherited not only Jerusalem's stories, it inherited stars from somewhere far more ancient and forgotten. In the year 1672, Pope Clement X issued a papal decree intended for cathedral reading throughout Europe, yet it never occurred. The document, signed and sealed with golden wax, disappeared before reaching any bishop. For centuries its existence faded to memory, its contents unknown. It became eventually more legend than record, until a single sentence emerged in an unexpected location within the Vatican Apostolic Archive. Buried among missionary correspondence from Central America, a Jesuit report mentioned a celestial calculation too hazardous to announce. Quoting directly from the missing document, the phrase stirred scholars who examined it. Yet when they sought the decree itself, they found nothing. This continued until 1991, when retired archivist Father Leone discovered a sealed envelope behind loose masonry in an abandoned storage chamber beneath the library. Inside lay weathered parchment bearing Pope Clement X's seal. The ink had faded, yet the words remained readable. The decree warned of what it termed Mathematica Divina, divine mathematics entering Christian territories through colonial routes. It described calculations predicting solar movements with supernatural precision, inscriptions discovered on stone matching Revelation's patterns, and, most disturbing of all, a calendar created not by clerical men, but by jungle sky watchers. It referenced Mayan codices explicitly. The document commanded immediate seizure of such texts arriving at European harbours. It prohibited further publication of astronomical discoveries originating in the Americas without Congregation for the Doctrine of the Faith review, and it contained a final statement, underlined in red, that no wheel of time supplants the cross. Why the decree never reached distribution remains mysterious. Some believe it faced suppression within the Vatican itself. Others claim the courier bearing it died suddenly in Rome and the document was misplaced for centuries. Yet the consequence of its disappearance was evident. Without the warning, scholars continued studying and comparing the Mayan calendar. Some even whispered of connections between it and liturgical year structure. Father Leone, disturbed by what he had read, made a private notation before resealing the document and delivering it to archivists. His note simply stated, "They feared the stars because they already understood their message." The decree was quietly refiled, marked with restricted access designation and officially denied by Vatican press representatives when questioned years later. Yet copies have emerged, handwritten, incomplete, each spreading the same caution. The stars were not silent, they were communicating, and some within the Church feared their words. Perhaps the decree was not lost accidentally. Perhaps it was buried not to shield the faithful, but to protect the calendar from crumbling beneath their feet. Throughout most of the world, time is presented as a straight path. One instant passes, then another, always advancing, never returning. The Church embraced this perspective early, building centuries of theology around beginning and conclusion concepts, Genesis and Revelation, birth and judgment, Alpha and Omega. Yet hidden within the Vatican's lesser-read texts lies a quiet debate that never reached Sunday sermons. In the late 18th century, a small group of Vatican theologians began questioning that straight path. Their doubts arose not from scripture, but from the jungle. They had been studying translated portions of Mayan codices, smuggled to Rome by missionaries who had defied destruction orders. These documents portrayed time not as a river, but as a wheel. The world did not begin and conclude. It rotated, repeating in patterns, ages following ages in a dance without end. One priest, Father Giacomo Balestra, wrote, "If time moves in circles, then prophecy does not only point forward, it returns." He suggested that Revelation's foretold events were not unique to the future, but past echoes, repeating in new forms with each great wheel turn. His concepts met with silence, yet others quietly concurred. In the year 1810, an anonymous document was placed in the Vatican Library's archive reading It was unsigned, yet clearly authored by someone with elevated access. The title was Chronos, not Christ. The paper questioned whether the Church had confused the cross symbol with the circle. It argued that the Mayans had grasped a truth Christianity had chosen to forget. Time is not linear. It returns, and within that return lies creation's true form. The paper was confiscated. No investigation followed. Yet the whispers persisted. Over the following century, Vatican astronomers began noting cyclical events more carefully. Eclipses, comets, solar flares. One even charted them alongside major church occurrences. The pattern, he claimed, was remarkable. Each spiritual crisis had a celestial mirror. By the early 1900s, these connections were buried under war and transformation. Yet in the year 2012, on the eve of the date many feared marked world's end, an internal Vatican memorandum was quietly distributed. It stated, "Let us not fear time's turn. The circle is not our enemy. The circle is Christ. No one claimed authorship. No public declaration was made." Yet those who had studied the codices understood its meaning. The Mayans had not predicted destruction. They had indicated renewal, not a final chapter, but one age is closing and another's beginning. And if time turns like a wheel, then the past is not behind us. It is waiting directly ahead. It stands quietly behind thick walls, positioned near the apostolic palace edge, unnoticed by most who pass through the Vatican. At first glance, the tower appears like any other part of the ancient city's architecture, stone, arched and weathered by time. Yet what few realise is that this structure, built in the late 16th century, was not designed for defence or devotion. It was built to observe the stars. The Vatican Tower of the Winds, as official records name it, has long been connected to calendar reforms and early weather studies. Yet beneath that narrative lies another, whispered only by those who have spent time in its upper chamber. The room, shaped like a circle, is painted with old constellations, some familiar and others long forgotten. 4 narrow windows face each cardinal direction. At night, they frame the sky with stunning precision. It is here, according to hidden documents and unrecorded testimonies, that a secret order of Vatican astronomers began charting patterns that did not match European models. These patterns came not from Greek tradition, but from Mayan sources, symbols copied from codices that were never publicly acknowledged. In the year 1894, a young Jesuit named Father Emmanuel Borja was given permission to observe from the tower during the solstice. He brought with him a translated page of a Mayan calendar and aligned it with the southern stars. What he saw disturbed him. The constellations matched the glyphs not just in shape, but in timing, he wrote in his journal. They were watching the same sky, but they saw further. Weeks later, Father Borgia was transferred. Without warning, his telescope was removed, yet the entry remained in his journal, which was later found in a locked drawer inside the observatory itself. In the mid-20th century, the tower was closed for restoration, yet no work was visible from outside. Scholars say instruments were removed and replaced with more advanced tools, though none were listed in official inventories. Around that same time, a private staircase was built, leading to an even higher platform, one that had no known purpose. There is a rumour among Vatican insiders that on certain nights, especially during eclipses, the highest chamber is occupied. A single candle burns behind the eastern window. And sometimes strange reflections are seen in the glass, shaped like circles within circles. One anonymous source once claimed that the true purpose of the tower is not to study the stars as they are, but to watch for when they return, that it was built not just to observe the heavens, but to receive a signal long awaited, something older than Rome, hidden beneath layers of faith and silence. Perhaps that is why the tower still stands untouched by time, because inside it, the sky continues to turn, and someone, even now, is watching it closely. In the early years of the 20th century, long after most missionaries had left the deep jungles of Central America, a small group of Jesuit priests made their way into the rainforest. They carried no crosses, wore no vestments, and travelled without local guides. Their mission was not to convert, but to search. Officially, they were listed as botanical researchers from a university in Rome, yet the names matched known members of the Jesuit order. Their funding came not from any academic institution, but through a quiet Vatican account. And the journal of one priest, found years later, suggested their goal had little to do with plants. It began with a rumour. A trader from Belize had spoken of a hidden valley where stone markers pointed not north, but to the rising of the midwinter sun. He said he had found a carved disc there, etched with glyphs that glowed faintly in moonlight. The Vatican had dismissed stories like this before, yet this one was different. A letter describing the disc had been written in Spanish, then translated into Latin by a bishop known for his work on ancient prophecy. In the spring of 1907, the Jesuits left Rome. They landed in Veracruz, then vanished into the southern forests. There was no public record of their route. For over a year, nothing was heard. Then one letter arrived. It was addressed not to a bishop or archivist, but to an astronomer at the Vatican Observatory. The letter was brief, handwritten in careful ink, and said only, "The sky here follows a rhythm. The stones know it. We are beginning to understand." After that, silence. Years passed. The world changed. Wars came and went, yet the rainforest held its secrets. In 1941, a field researcher studying bird migration stumbled upon a collapsed shelter deep in the jungle. Inside were rusted instruments, a wooden crucifix blackened with age, and a notebook sealed in wax. It was marked with the symbol of the Society of Jesus. The pages were damp and faded, yet some words remained. Charts of star positions, sketches of temple walls, and one phrase repeated several times, always in Latin, "De solis redditus," the day the sun returns. The researcher turned the notebook over to a local priest, who passed it on to a Vatican contact. It was never seen again. Yet, stories of those priests still linger. In the villages, old men remember strangers who spoke their language and asked questions about the sky. Women recall visitors who sat quietly during solstice ceremonies, hands folded, eyes wide. They never tried to stop the rituals. They watched. And perhaps what they saw was not something to convert or erase, but something to carry back across the ocean. A secret, a rhythm, a calendar too old to be written by man. And maybe, just maybe, the forest remembered them too. The Codex Vez was not supposed to exist. By all accounts, it had been lost in the fires of Yucatan in the 16th century, when Spanish clergy burned entire libraries of Mayan texts. Yet one fragile copy, written on deerskin and sealed inside a hollow idol, was discovered in the late 1800s by a travelling priest named Father Ignacio Vez. He sent it quietly to Rome, addressed not to a bishop but to the Vatican Astronomical Office. For years it remained unopened in a wooden crate, stored beneath the marble floors of the Apostolic Archive. Only in 1916, during an effort to catalogue unregistered documents, did it resurface. A young archivist, Sister Lucia, was the first to read its contents. What she found inside was not a calendar in the traditional sense. It was a countdown. The codex listed days not in straight lines, but in spirals, winding inward toward a single event. At its centre was an image that startled even the most reserved Vatican scholars. A great serpent curled around a temple, its tongue made of flame, its eye aligned with a falling star. Beneath it were the glyphs for sun, fire, and ending. At first it was dismissed as symbolic. Apocalyptic language was common in ancient cultures. Yet then, someone matched the final date. It was December 21st, 2012. The date had already become infamous in public imagination, tied to fear and fantasy. Yet here, within a text never seen by the outside world, it appeared in solemn clarity. A prophecy written long before European ships ever touched American shores. Sister Lucia made a copy of the Codex's final page and passed it to her superior. Within days, she was reassigned. Her notes were removed. The original Codex was placed in a sealed vault beneath the Vatican Library. Yet something else was found. Tucked inside the folds of the deerskin was a strip of parchment, clearly European in origin. The ink was faded, the script Latin. It was a letter, unsigned, possibly written by Father Vez himself. It read, "The fire they feared is not of death, but of truth. It is a light that burns through walls." For years afterward, astronomers at the Vatican began tracking solar flares with unusual focus. One even requested access to archives on the aurora borealis, claiming a link between solar storms and Mayan prophecy. His request was denied, and then, on December 21st, 2012, something strange happened. The Vatican Observatory, located far from Rome in the hills of Arizona, reportedly shut down without explanation for 7 hours. No public record was given. No photographs were ever published. Some claim the blaze wasn't physical at all, but mystical, a vision that emerged and vanished without sound. Yet others still question whether that old spiral truly didn't conclude in fire. Perhaps it merely rotated once more, and the flame it promised still lingers, waiting not for destruction, but to be witnessed. During spring 1937, a Vatican researcher called Father Alessandro Bernardi disembarked from a ship at Puerto Barrios port in Guatemala. He spoke softly, stood tall, and constantly carried a small leather briefcase. Residents recalled his gentleness and quiet fascination. He claimed he'd arrived to examine ancient masonry, nothing else. Yet truthfully, Father Bernardi sought something the Vatican had been monitoring for almost 100 years. Pieces of a Maya manuscript thought to have escaped the colonial destruction. The Vatican never acknowledged this expedition. His identity appears in no official travel documentation. Yet clues exist in stored correspondence. Hastily written messages between Jesuit clergy, one stating, "Bernardi travels where the flame once descended. May he return before it ignites anew." He established base camp beside ruins deep within the jungle, close to the Copan location. For 60 days he mailed reports to Rome describing the inscriptions. He discovered hieroglyphs repeatedly showing the solar symbol surrounded by plumes. This identical symbol appeared in previous Vatican drawings recovered from the Codex Vez. The connection was sufficient to generate enthusiasm in specific chambers below St. Peter's Basilica. Then the correspondence ceased. By August that same year, no communication had arrived from Father Bernardi. A rescue was requested, but the regional diocese insisted no available personnel could be spared. The Vatican lodged no formal protest. A decade afterward, in a secluded corner of the Apostolic Archive, a missionary account emerged. It was never released publicly. Within, it described a dwelling discovered overgrown with creepers and decaying from dampness. No corpse was found, but a diary had been left open upon a stone platform. The last entry, penned in Bernardi's handwriting, read, "The sun emerged today, not as illumination, but as sound. It sang through the rock. The journal was returned to Rome. It vanished forever." In 1961, a Vatican librarian discovered a hand-sketched chart tucked within pages of a 17th-century astronomy text. The chart bore red markings. Along its border appeared one word: Bernardi. The position was unmistakable, directly above Guatemala's jungles, where herbs and vegetation had erased most trails. Some believe Father Bernardi disappeared into the wilderness, taken by sickness or mishap. Others suspect he departed willingly, transforming from researcher to devotee. The peculiar aspect isn't his disappearance, it's that nobody ever searched for him. Not formally, not openly. Still, in years following his vanishing, Vatican astronomers began mentioning the Copan area more frequently in their confidential star maps. A fresh constellation series was quietly incorporated into internal Vatican records. One formation, resembling a spiral sun, is marked simply B37. B representing Bernardi, 37 for the year he disappeared and possibly the year he discovered what he was never meant to witness. It was a peaceful spring in Rome. The year stood at 1962. Within the stone corridors of the Vatican's Theological Institute, a manuscript travelled from one set of hands to the next. Its binding was plain, wrapped in crimson leather, unmarked by name or creator. Yet its contents would echo through private passages like a murmur carried by flame. The manuscript bore the heading, "On the Revolution of the Sun." It had been authored by a respected Vatican theologian, Father Mauro Rinaldi, a scholar of eschatology, the examination of final times. Father Rinaldi was recognised for his meticulous research, never prone to theatrics or outlandish assertions. This document was distinct. It wasn't conjecture, it was an alert. The manuscript suggested that ancient Mesoamerican wisdom, especially Maya cosmic patterns, corresponded not merely with solar and planetary movements, but with concealed sections in the Book of Revelation. Rinaldi proposed that the Maya notion of the fifth sun, the conviction in recurring worlds, created and demolished through flame, wind and deluge, wasn't legend but recollection, a recollection reflected in holy text. He compared Maya symbols with Hebrew apocalyptic signs, linking dates from the long count system to crucial moments in church chronicle. The collapse of the Western Roman Empire, the Black Death, and even the crucifixion. His determination was disturbing. December 21st, 2012 wasn't the conclusion. It marked a moment of revelation, the ultimate transition before what he termed the era of return. He insisted that the Church recognise the parallel, not to adopt Maya doctrine, but to prepare, not for annihilation, but for awakening. The manuscript was presented for examination that summer. By autumn, it had vanished. Father Rinaldi never mentioned it again. Actually, he never spoke whatsoever. Days following submission of the work, he experienced what was characterized as sudden muteness, a mental collapse that rendered him unable to speak or write. He was transferred quietly to a monastery in southern Italy, where he remained in isolation for his remaining years. No explanation was ever discovered. Behind closed doors, the document wasn't forgotten. A single copy was stored in a restricted area of the Apostolic Archive. It bore a stamp used exclusively for materials considered destabilizing to doctrine. That marking in Latin states Custodia Silentium, maintain the silence. Years later, a visiting Jesuit noted seeing the manuscript sealed, untouched, resting alongside a Maya Codex fragment that glowed dimly under ultraviolet illumination. To this day, On the Revolution of the Sun has never been published, never referenced, and never officially refuted. It remains among the rare theological works silenced before a single word ever reached the public. Yet the sun has revolved, and perhaps the prophecy wasn't silenced. Perhaps it was merely postponed. Below the marble flooring of St. Peter's Basilica exists a realm few have observed and fewer comprehend. The Vatican catacombs form a labyrinth of tombs, altars and ancient stones, final resting place for popes, saints and secrets too aged for parchment. Yet among all the chapels and crypts, one location is mentioned only in hushed tones. A stairway, one that descends into blackness and then halts. The steps were initially noted in a confidential maintenance record from 1939. A structural crew working below the basilica had uncovered a sealed entrance half concealed behind a crumbled wall. When opened, it revealed a descending coil of weathered stone steps, slick with wetness and covered with dust too fine to be from this era. The strangest aspect, according to the account, was that the steps extended only so far. After 14 turns, they terminated at a smooth stone barrier with no marking, no opening, no draft. The Vatican didn't request additional excavation, but someone returned. In 1967, a young Swiss guard named Matteo Lang was assigned overnight duty near the catacombs. In a personal letter later retrieved by his nephew, Lang described hearing a soft sound emerging from the floor, like wind moving through dried foliage. Curious, he followed the noise and found himself standing above the ancient stairwell. It was unlit, cold, and so quiet it seemed to absorb breath itself. Lang stepped down, counting each turn. When he reached the bottom, he saw the stone barrier. But in his letter, he wrote something peculiar. The wall didn't feel like the others. It was warm, and beyond it, I heard humming. He was transferred 14 days later. No reference to the stairway appears in official Vatican maps, but one archivist, an elderly monk called Brother Silvano, spoke of a legend transmitted only through spoken tradition. He claimed that during the late 17th century, a wooden container had arrived from the Americas addressed to the Congregation for the Doctrine of the Faith. Inside was an obsidian slab marked with Maya hieroglyphs. It was said to vibrate when exposed to sunlight. The container was sealed and interred beneath the Vatican for protection, not in the vaults, but somewhere deeper, somewhere hidden. And perhaps that's what rests behind the barrier at the base of the stairwell. Not emptiness, but a chamber. A vault constructed not to be accessed, but to be forgotten. A place the Church dared not destroy, yet also dared not reveal. No lights exist down there, no documentation, only the faint sound of humming that nobody has ever explained, and a staircase that begins beneath one of the holiest locations on earth and ends in silence. There exists a chapel beneath the Vatican that is seldom discussed. It's not included in tourist guides, not featured in any organised tours, and not displayed in architectural records available to the public. Those familiar with it call it La Capella Silente, the Silent Chapel. Small, candlelit, and constructed of ancient Roman stone, it sits near the old necropolis, close to where St. Peter himself is believed to be interred. But something about this chapel doesn't fit. During summer 1954, a French art historian named Elise Moreau was granted exceptional access to examine frescoes concealed within the chapel. She had arrived expecting traditional religious imagery, scenes of saints, martyrs, and angels. But what she discovered carved faintly into the wall corners was something she couldn't explain. Symbols not Christian, not Roman, but Maya. Etched into the pillar base was the unmistakable form of the solar disk used by priests at Chichen Itza. Nearby, along the ceiling arch, was a serpent with feathered wings, Quetzalcoatl or Kukulkan, depending on the area. And in the chapel's stone floor, nearly invisible beneath layers of dust and wax, were 3 interlocking spirals, Maya hieroglyphs hidden in plain sight at the centre of Roman Catholic authority. When Moreau brought her discoveries to the Vatican curator accompanying her, he turned pale. He asked her not to mention what she had observed, then quickly concluded the tour. She was never welcomed back. But before departing, she made a charcoal impression of the spirals and carried it home to Paris. Years later, in 1971, her son donated that impression to an anthropology museum. It remained in a drawer for nearly 10 years before someone finally recognised it. The glyph meant "cycle of suns," a phrase connected directly to Maya prophecy. How could such symbols have reached a Roman chapel? No record exists of Vatican artists ever journeying to Central America during the early Renaissance. No evidence of commerce, no basis for influence. Yet the designs matched perfectly down to the curves of each line and the alignment of the spirals. Some scholars suggest the chapel was renovated during the 17th century, at the height of Jesuit activity in the Americas. Perhaps a missionary brought back sketches, carvings, or even beliefs. Others believe the symbols are older still, carved into the stone before the chapel was even constructed. But if that's accurate, the implications are far more mysterious, because it would mean that long before the first Spanish vessels touched Maya coasts, someone had already transported those symbols across the ocean and carved them into the foundations of faith. A quiet reminder, hidden beneath layers of incense and prayer, that the Church may not possess all the secrets. Sometimes the stone remembers what the scriptures forget. His name was Father Ignacio de Solana, a quiet Jesuit scholar born in the hills of Castile in 1684. From an early age, he displayed an exceptional talent for language. By age 20, he had mastered Latin, Greek, and Hebrew. But when the Society of Jesus sent him to New Spain, it wasn't the sacred tongues of the Church he became known for. It was Nahuatl, the language of the Aztecs, and surprisingly the Maya of certain regions. Most missionaries learned just enough to preach, but Father Ignacio went further. He listened, he recorded, he spoke fluently with village elders and temple keepers, even those who mistrusted the Church. There were whispers among other priests that he could recite Maya prayers backward and translate stories that had never been spoken outside the rainforest. What made him different wasn't his understanding of words, but the way he believed they connected. In his journals, some of which still exist in fragments, he wrote of a linguistic mirror between Nahuatl and certain lost dialects of Aramaic. He believed the sounds, the symbols, even the structure of these ancient American tongues shared something buried in time with the languages of early scripture. It was a theory the Church didn't welcome. In 1715, he returned briefly to Rome to deliver a report to the Vatican Curia. That report, sealed in the archive, was never published. But a letter he wrote to a fellow Jesuit reveals his deepening concern. He described visions of a great stone sun rotating over St. Peter's Basilica. He spoke of elders who warned him that a cycle was nearing its end, and he hinted that Nahuatl held clues not just to the past, but to the future. One particular note stands out. In the root of the Nahuatl word for fire, he wrote, there is also the root for time. To burn is to begin again. Father Ignacio's mastery of native tongues soon drew suspicion. Other clergy accused him of being too close to the rituals he was supposed to oppose. By 1721, he was recalled to Rome under quiet orders. He arrived, but not as himself. Witnesses described him as distant, fevered, often speaking Nahuatl in his sleep. He carried a carved obsidian pendant etched with unfamiliar symbols, which he refused to remove. After just 6 weeks in Rome, he vanished. No record of departure, no transfer, no burial, only a note left in his cell. The tongue has memory, and the memory has returned. The Vatican declared him missing, but in the margins of one Jesuit ledger from that year, a scribe wrote something strange beside his name. He did not leave. He translated. To this day, the pendant he wore is believed to be kept in the restricted vault of the Vatican Library. Its symbols have never been decoded, and its voice, if ever heard again, might speak not of the past, but of something still coming. In the cool stillness beneath St. Peter's Basilica, there rests the tomb of Pope Innocent X. His marble likeness lies carved in silence, hands folded in prayer, draped in stone vestments that never move. But it isn't his name that stirs whispers in the archive halls. It's what lies carved into the space just above his clasped fingers. Not a cross, not a dove, but a circle. A solar disk. It was first noticed by a Vatican archivist named Father Leone Bianchi in 1974. While preparing updated records of papal tombs, he paused over the symbol. Initially, he thought it was merely a decorative flourish, but under the right light, it revealed something more. Rays arranged in exact symmetry with smaller circles embedded around the center, echoing the ancient design found on Maya temple carvings. Father Bianchi wasn't the only one to notice. A month later, a group of church historians met in a private commission to discuss possible non-Christian iconography found on papal monuments. It wasn't the first time such concerns had arisen, but this case was different, because beneath the solar disk, carved so faintly it could only be seen in angled shadow, was the outline of a rosary. The beads were not traditional, they were square. When magnified, they revealed tiny symbols inside each one. Glyphs. Not Roman, not Latin, but unmistakably Maya. The official explanation was cautious. It was suggested the design had been added by an overzealous sculptor, perhaps one inspired by the recent rise in global archaeological interest. But a document surfaced shortly after, buried in the personal effects of a deceased cardinal, that cast doubt on that theory. The document dated back to the late 1700s and described a gift sent to the Vatican from a Jesuit mission in Yucatan. A stone medallion shaped like a sun, with a hole in its centre and carvings around the edge that glowed orange when held to the light. It was kept in a private chapel for years, and then, according to the note, it was interred with him, that the cycle might remain closed. The cardinal who wrote that note was present at the funeral of Pope Innocent X. No official records confirm the medallion's existence, but sculptors from the time period didn't work from imagination. They carved what they were told to carve and what the church permitted. Which means someone, somewhere in the Vatican, instructed that a Maya solar disk be placed above a pope's resting hands, alongside a rosary strung with ancient glyphs. Perhaps they believed the disk symbolized Christ, the light of the world. Perhaps they hoped no one would ever look closely enough to see the truth. But the sun remembers, and on the stone surface of a silent tomb, history glows quietly, waiting for someone to notice. It occurred late one evening in 1992, inside the Vatican Apostolic Archive. The building was closed to visitors, and most of the staff had already departed. But one man remained, Father Giacomo Ventresca, an aging archivist with a quiet mind and careful hands, had stayed behind to review a set of documents recently transferred from the Congregation for the Doctrine of the Faith. The air in the room was still, cold stone beneath his feet, shelves stretching high above, filled with secrets bound in leather and dust. Father Ventresca sat at a wide wooden table, a single lamp casting long shadows across parchment. The file before him was ordinary at first glance. Mission records from Central America in the 17th century, faded ink, dated signatures. But tucked inside one folder was a small sheet of parchment, much older than the rest. On it was a diagram, a stepped pyramid surrounded by stars, with a serpent winding up from the base toward the peak. He leaned in closer, and then the lights went out. Not a flicker, not a slow fade, just sudden, absolute darkness. At first he thought the power had failed, but his lamp had been oil-fed. There should have been a glow. Instead, there was only silence and a strange warmth on his face, like sunlight. He looked up. Hovering in the dark, suspended above the table, was a faint image. At first, he thought it was smoke, but the image sharpened, becoming clear. It was a Maya pyramid, not drawn, projected as if etched in light itself. He described it later as glowing amber with moving shadows around its edges. The stars behind it shifted slowly, aligning in a pattern he couldn't recognize. And then he heard something. Not a voice, but a low humming, like the sound of wind circling inside a shell. The entire vision lasted less than a minute. Then the light was gone. The lamp flickered back on, the warmth vanished, and the room was once again just a room. He reported the event quietly to his superior. A week later, he was reassigned to a monastery outside Florence. No formal statement was ever made, but in his private notes, which surfaced years later, he wrote something that still haunts researchers today. It wasn't a dream, it was a memory. The room still carried it. Not mine, but the stones. The Vatican has never acknowledged any technology that could cause such an event. No projection system, no equipment, and the parchment with the pyramid diagram was quietly removed from circulation. But that room in the archive, room 11B, is now only used for brief appointments. No extended stays, no night work, and those who enter it after dark say the air feels warmer there, as if something, once revealed, is waiting to be seen again. His name was Cardinal Mateo Ramirez, and for most of his life he was known as a brilliant theologian and a trusted voice. In the halls of the Vatican he spoke with calm authority, taught scripture with clarity, and kept his private thoughts buried deep beneath his red robes. But in the final months before his resignation in 1983, something changed. He began to speak of time not as a straight line, but as a wheel. Colleagues noticed it first in his sermons. He started referencing the stars more often, quoting not just scripture, but ancient writers the Church rarely named. Some thought it was poetic, others thought it strange, but no one expected what came next. In a closed-door session with the Pontifical Biblical Commission, Cardinal Ramirez presented a document nearly 400 years old. It had never been catalogued. Bound in black leather with no title on the cover, it was filled with pages of handwritten Latin side by side with symbols from an entirely different world. Maya glyphs. The text made a bold claim that the Maya prophecy of the Son's return was not only true but aligned with passages from the Book of Revelation. The author, a Jesuit priest from the 17th century, had written that the final cycle of time would not end in destruction, but in unveiling, a moment when hidden truths would rise to the surface as the old world gave way to something new. Ramirez had found the document in a private drawer inside the Vatican library. It had not been touched in decades. He called it the Mirror Manuscript. After reading it, Ramirez grew distant. He stopped attending formal dinners. He no longer accepted interviews. And then one quiet morning in June of that year, he handed in his resignation without explanation. He left behind a small envelope sealed in wax, addressed to the Pope. Its contents were never made public, but a Vatican source claimed it contained only 3 words, handwritten in dark ink. The circle closes. Ramirez moved to a quiet monastery in southern Italy. He lived there for less than a year before passing away in his sleep. No foul play was suspected, but a young novice who had served him recalled something unsettling. He said Ramirez often stood at night near the chapel window staring at the moon. For hours he would whisper to himself, not in Latin, not in Italian, but in Nahuatl. And once the novice claimed he asked the cardinal what he was waiting for. Ramirez had smiled faintly. Not the end, he said, but the return. To this day, his resignation remains one of the quietest exits by a cardinal in modern Vatican history. And the manuscript he revealed, now kept under lock and key deep within the restricted section of the Vatican archives, in a vault labelled simply Codex Sol. They were supposed to be routine letters, accounts from missionaries in the New World sent back to the Vatican during the early 16th century, bound in canvas and marked with the seal of the Spanish crown. The documents were shelved in a quiet wing of the Vatican Apostolic Archive and mostly forgotten. Centuries passed, dust settled, names faded. But one evening in 1958, a junior archivist named Tomas Celano opened the wrong drawer, or perhaps the right one. Inside was a packet labelled Manuscripta Indi Occidentalis. The handwriting was old, barely legible, but what caught Celano's attention were the symbols scribbled in the margins, strange circular patterns and serpent shapes. These were not from Europe, they were Maya. The manuscripts were authored by a Franciscan friar named Juan de Segura, who had been stationed in present-day Honduras in the 1500s. His tone was not that of a conqueror, nor of a priest seeking to convert. Instead, his words read like someone trying to understand, to listen, to record. He spoke of a group of native elders who called themselves the Keepers of the Sun's Voice. They said they were waiting for a signal, a great awakening written in stone ages before the first Christian symbols reached their lands. They whispered of a fifth age, an era when illumination would not merely return but transform, unveiling what had always been concealed in open view. Father Juan chose not to dispute their words. He recorded their statements carefully. Yet one expression surfaced repeatedly in his notes, like an echo that wouldn't fade. The heavens will collapse. No scholar in the archives could decipher its meaning. None could explain why the manuscript's final pages had vanished. Ripped, not severed, taken with violence. Celano discreetly reported the discovery to his supervisor. The papers were marked for restricted examination, then vanished from access. But before they were locked away, Celano transcribed one last passage. When the cycle completes, and the stone serpent raises its head, those born of sun and ink shall emerge. They will bear no crowns. They will carry no blades, yet they will speak the name once buried beneath white vestments. The phrase sun and ink confounded Vatican researchers. Some believed it referenced parchment. Others suspected it meant flesh. A few murmured that it indicated something more ancient, a heritage concealed within the bloodlines of those who recalled the constellations. Now, that drawer remains sealed, and the bundle of Father Juan's writings lies within a frigid, shadowed vault, monitored by none, witnessed by none. Yet the tale has already broken free, preserved in copies within journals, in recollection, and perhaps in blood. Even at this moment, somewhere deep in the rainforest, a descendant of the sun's voice waits, guarding a secret the Vatican once sought to entomb beneath layers of stone, silence, and centuries. The Chamber of Tears remains hushed. It has always been so. Hidden beyond the Sistine Chapel, it waits in stillness, prepared for one singular moment. The instant when a newly elected pope dons his ceremonial robes for the first time. The name carries no poetry, it is earned through experience. Nearly every man who enters that room alone, freshly chosen and crushed by the burden of history, sheds tears. Some weep from happiness, others from terror. But in 2005, one man emerged ashen, trembling and speechless for almost an hour. That man was Cardinal Pietro de Rossi. He had been deemed unlikely, a contemplative, reserved cleric, recognised for his expertise in ancient manuscripts and his decades in Latin America. When the white smoke appeared, however, his name echoed through the corridors, and soon he stood before the masses in St. Peter's Square as the new Holy Father. What occurred before that moment has never entered any official documentation. Following tradition, after the election, he was escorted to the Chamber of Tears. There, 3 sets of papal vestments waited for him, small, medium, and large. He selected his size with shaking fingers. The door closed behind him, and for 10 minutes no one else entered. When the door reopened, the assistants discovered him standing motionless, gazing at the distant wall. His complexion was ghostly, his fists clenched. He repeated only one phrase continuously. "The serpent lies beneath the city." He offered no explanation. He declined water. He demanded the balcony appearance be postponed. Later, a cardinal who met with him privately would remember the details from inside that room. De Rossi claimed to have sensed something. Not an audible voice, but a presence that occupied the space behind him. He did not turn to confront it. He said it communicated in a language he had encountered only once before in the Guatemalan highlands. Nahuatl or something similar, though he had never fully grasped the dialect. One word emerged clearly: coatl, serpent, he explained. The voice carried no anger. It was not boisterous, it was patient. And when he turned toward the mirror beside the dressing table, he saw not his reflection, Only stone, a carved surface, a spiral at its centre. Within 24 hours he had abdicated the papacy before his new title was ever proclaimed. A discreet medical explanation was provided: exhaustion, a minor cardiac incident. Yet the official records show nothing definitive. No one discusses it openly, but the mirror in the Chamber of Tears was replaced. Several months later, the original was removed, shattered and discarded. No one explained the reason. And in the hushed corners of the Vatican Library, some whisper that De Rossi did not witness the world's end reflected back at him. He saw its beginning, and the church was not at its heart. It was merely one stone among countless others. Few locations are more hallowed, more breathtaking than the Sistine Chapel, its painted ceiling stretching high above the heads of millions. It has narrated the story of Genesis since the early 16th century. Yet within those sacred brushstrokes of Michelangelo's genius, some believe there exists a second narrative, one the Vatican has never acknowledged, but one it may have dreaded. Recently in 2009, a young Vatican-trained art historian named Luisa Benedetti was granted private access to examine the chapel under dim lighting, long after the crowds had departed. She had devoted years to deciphering religious art, discovering patterns in hues, geometry and posture. But what she observed that evening sent ice through her veins. It started with the central panel, the renowned creation of Adam. Everyone recognizes the image, God extending toward man, their fingertips nearly meeting. But Luisa perceived something different. Behind the figure of God was not merely a swirl of angels, but a distinct form, an outline. Not a random cluster of bodies, but something intentional, a spiral. She recalled the symbols from the Mayan codices. Spirals often signified time or movement through cycles. She examined the lower panels again, the shape recurring in the folds of garments, in the curve of a serpent, in the arrangement of extended limbs. What stole her breath, though, was a tiny pattern near the separation of light from darkness. In a small corner, barely larger than a palm, was a painted star cluster that matched no recognized Christian constellation, but it did correspond to something else. The Codex Vez, one of the Mayan texts thought to be destroyed, described a star pattern that aligned on December 21st, 2012. 3 stars in an arc, followed by a single crimson dot. Luisa cross-referenced the Sistine image with digital overlays. It matched perfectly, and the crimson dot? It was positioned above the hand of God. That evening, Luisa presented her discoveries to a senior Vatican scholar. He listened in silence, then requested her research notes. She surrendered them. He expressed gratitude. She was never contacted again. 6 months later, her Vatican credentials were quietly revoked. But in a private interview conducted before her departure, she said something that has remained in the memory of those who heard her words. She said Michelangelo may not have been attempting to show the creation of man alone. He may have been encoding a cycle, a prophecy, a moment when divine power would reach once again, not downward, but back around a circle, a return. And perhaps, hidden in the chapel where new popes are selected, was a message not just for the faithful, but for those who understood the language of stars and stone. The Vatican has never responded to these assertions, but the chapel endures, so do the paintings. And sometimes if you observe long enough you begin to question, was Michelangelo only painting the beginning of time or its conclusion? On the morning of December 21st, 2012, the air around Mount Graham was frigid and thin. The sky above was crystal clear, stretched wide over the Arizona desert. It was a perfect evening for observing the stars. But inside the Vatican Advanced Technology Telescope, the lights were extinguished. The lens was shrouded. The systems were shut down. No one at the Vatican Observatory offered an explanation. No press statement, no technical difficulties, only silence. For years, the telescope on Mount Graham had been among the most powerful instruments in the Vatican's study of the cosmos. Operated by Jesuit astronomers, it peered deep into the night sky, tracking celestial movements and studying phenomena far beyond Earth. It was a bridge between faith and science, a symbol of transparency, but not that evening. That evening, the observatory went dark. It was not accidental. Maintenance was not scheduled. In fact, internal records later revealed that the telescope had been operational and prepared. Just before midnight, the system was manually disabled. The decision came from Father Emilio Herrera, the lead Jesuit astronomer at the facility. He left no written orders, but in a private letter to a colleague later leaked, he wrote one strange line: "We are not intended to observe the sky tonight." Why? The date was no mystery. December 21st, 2012. The conclusion of the Mayan long count calendar. The day some feared would mark the end of existence. But the Vatican had dismissed such concerns publicly. Their own spokesperson had labelled the prophecy a misinterpretation of ancient symbols. So why did the Church's most advanced eye into the cosmos choose not to look? Some believe it related to alignment. That evening, several celestial bodies were set to form a rare configuration. It was not spectacular, nothing visible to the naked eye. But for those who understood the ancient Mayan charts, it was significant, a symbolic return. A moment when the Sun, Earth, and the galactic centre all formed a nearly straight line. In the Mayan codices, such a moment was known as the Great Crossing. Father Herrera had studied those texts during his time in South America. He had once written a paper comparing Mayan star law with Christian eschatology. The paper was never published, but one phrase in his draft stood out. When the crossing arrives, he wrote, "Do not look up, look within." After that evening, Father Herrera resigned from his position. He returned to Rome, where he now lives in quiet seclusion. He has never spoken publicly about the telescope again. To this day, no one knows what the Vatican expected to see or what they feared they might discover. But the lens remained sealed, the stars went unrecorded, and on the longest night of that year the Church turned its attention inward, away from the heavens it had studied for centuries, as if something in the sky was never meant to be witnessed. Not long after the world failed to end on December 21st, 2012, the Vatican quietly assembled a group of scholars deep inside the walls of the Apostolic Palace. No ceremony, no announcements, only closed doors and the whisper of ancient robes against stone floors. The question they came to discuss was not whether the Mayans were mistaken, but whether the Church had misunderstood something much older, much deeper than doomsday. Apocalypse or awakening. The word apocalypse derives from the Greek, meaning to uncover, to reveal, and yet over the centuries it became entangled with fear and fire, with the end of time. But to the Mayans, the end of a cycle was not a collapse. It was a return, a turning of the great wheel. So what if their prophecy did not speak of the end of the world, but the end of the world as it was known? One Vatican theologian, Father Thomas Aquila, had studied both the Book of Revelation and the Popol Vuh, the Mayan story of creation. He found echoes in both. There were warnings of collapse, yes, but also promises of rebirth. He began to argue in private sessions that perhaps the prophecy pointed not to destruction, but to a moment of awakening. Not everyone agreed. A retired cardinal reportedly warned that such thinking bordered on heresy. But the whisper spread among young priests, archivists, and those who had read too many forbidden pages in too many hidden vaults. There was something unsettling in the timing, a quiet feeling that something had shifted, though no one could explain what. And then there was the vision. A priest from Colombia, Father Miguel Navarro, had been stationed in Guatemala in the months before the prophecy date. He returned to Rome, pale and hollow-eyed, claiming to have seen the sun rise twice in a single morning. His words were dismissed as poetic until another account, this time from a satellite technician, described a brief, unexplainable flicker in solar tracking data on that same morning. Just 1 second. A blink. Gone. Coincidence, perhaps, or a glimpse. At the heart of the debate sat a question the Vatican could not answer publicly. If time moves in cycles, and if the Mayans were correct about one of them ending, then what had just begun? A new age, a spiritual shift, or something still waiting, hidden in the slow ticking of the stars? No statement was issued, no doctrine declared, but a curious note was added to an internal theological bulletin in the spring of 2013. It read simply, "The turning of the sun does not destroy, it reveals." The Vatican, for all its power and history, remains a place of caution. But sometimes caution hides curiosity, and on the other side of fear there is always wonder. So perhaps the question was never whether the end had come, but whether we had the eyes to see what came after. In the depths of the Vatican Apostolic Archive, behind the older texts, wrapped in crumbling leather and faded ink, there exists a parchment, seldom spoken of, but often searched for. It is known by a name whispered among the archivists and passed down like a ghost story: De Solis Ordinibus, or the Orders of the Sun. Most would say it is myth, but for those who have seen its seal, the truth is far more curious. The document is believed to have been written in the 14th century, during the strange and silent papacy of Pope Innocent VI. Unlike his predecessors, Innocent held a fascination with the stars. He commissioned one of the earliest versions of a Vatican sky chart, far before the birth of modern astronomy. What the Church later called curiosities, he had referred to as heavenly cycles, and in the folds of that secret parchment he laid out something extraordinary, a doctrine built not on theology alone, but on time, the sun cycle doctrine. According to the text, history does not move in a straight line. It turns like the heavens, in great cycles. Each age, marked by a different face of the sun, was said to bring its own trials and revelations. The doctrine claimed there were 5 great suns, each one rising to shape the world and falling to cleanse it. Fire, flood, famine, silence, and then renewal. If this sounds familiar, it should. Centuries later, when Jesuit scholars in the New World uncovered fragments of Mayan codices, they were stunned to find nearly the same structure. The Mayans spoke of 5 suns as well. Each had ended in catastrophe. Each was part of a greater wheel. But here was the strange part. Both systems seemed to converge on the same point. The end of the 5th sun, December 21st, 2012. The match was too precise to ignore. A Vatican scholar named Brother Alvaro from the Pontifical Gregorian University once tried to publish an analysis comparing the Mayan and Catholic sun cycles. His manuscript was quietly rejected. When asked why, he responded only with a smile and said, "Some truths are not lost. They are hidden." He resigned the following year. But the whispers did not stop. They only deepened. A few claimed the Church had known for centuries that time would bend in on itself, that the doctrine had never been revoked, only buried. And when the world crossed that quiet threshold in the winter of 2012, nothing exploded, no fire fell from the sky, but something did change. In private conversations and closed-door symposiums, cardinals and scholars alike began asking the same question. If we have entered a new sun, what does it ask of us? And more chilling, what does it remember? Because every sun cycle begins with light, but it ends in shadow. And the Vatican, for all its knowledge, has never claimed to control the sky, only to watch and to wonder. In a small, climate-controlled chamber deep within the Vatican Library, behind reinforced glass, rests a book unlike any other. Its cover is made of bark-thin leather, and its pages are crafted not from paper, but from stretched fig tree fibre, known to scholars as a mattle. To the untrained eye, it is just another ancient manuscript. its surface stained with time and silent ink. But under ultraviolet light, the codex begins to breathe. The manuscript is known only by its catalogue number, hidden from public records, but among a few trusted curators, it is whispered about in low tones and cautious glances. They call it La Codex de Luz, the Codex of Light. And what makes it so mysterious is not only its age or origin, but what appears when the lights go out. Discovered in the early 20th century, during a quiet exchange between the Vatican and a private collector in Mexico, the codex arrived wrapped in layers of silk, sealed in wax, and marked with a warning in Spanish, "Do not show the sun to the night." At the time, few paid attention to that phrase. Most thought it poetic, or even nonsense. Until one archivist, a young Jesuit named Father Rinaldi, brought a small ultraviolet lamp into the chamber out of curiosity. What he saw would never leave him. Symbols invisible to the naked eye began to glow, not randomly, but in patterns. Circles, spirals, stars. What appeared to be a calendar unspooled across 2 pages, each symbol lighting up like stars on a black sky. But strangest of all, in the centre there was a figure, a serpent made of fire, wrapped around what looked like both a sun and a cross. Father Rinaldi tried to share his findings with his superiors. He wrote a report. He even sketched the glowing symbols by hand. But the codex was removed from his care within a week, placed under restricted access, and never mentioned again. Father Rinaldi was reassigned to a monastery in southern Italy. He never spoke of the codex again. Yet the Vatican's interest in this glowing book did not fade. A team of quiet researchers began to study the codex at night. There were no official reports, no published findings, but a note left behind by one of the scientists simply read, "The ink remembers something we have forgotten." Some believe the ink was treated with crushed minerals known to the ancient Mayans. Others say it was never ink at all, but something far older. A message meant to be revealed only when the world was ready, or when it needed to be warned. What has never been explained is that the glowing pattern ends on a single symbol, brighter than the rest. A flaming wheel surrounded by 4 points like compass directions, and beneath it, faint but real, are the only Roman letters in the entire manuscript. They spell Roma, as if the prophecy had always known where the path would end. The artifact was wrapped in linen, buried beneath layers of earth and stone, and sealed in silence for what some believe was over 1,000 years. It was unearthed in the early 1930s near the ruins of Copan in present-day Honduras by a team of European researchers funded in part by a Vatican-backed archaeological society. Among the crumbled walls and overgrown courtyards, it was not the temples or carvings that drew gasps. It was the contents of a small ceremonial box, half sunken in volcanic ash. Inside were 2 objects. One was a blade forged of obsidian, sharp as glass, with an edge so fine it could split a single hair. The other was a chalice made of gold, its rim traced with patterns of serpents and suns. Both were deeply weathered, yet strangely intact. But what startled the Vatican observer on site, a Jesuit historian named Father Luis Navarro, was not just the beauty of the objects. It was the design carved into the base of the chalice, a cross. A Latin cross, unmistakable in form, encircled by Mayan glyphs. Father Navarro kept a journal, meticulously recording every detail. In one entry, dated September 1933, he wrote, "The chalice bears not just a cross, but a familiar pattern, nearly identical to the relic used during Holy Week ceremonies in the Roman Rite. But this artifact is centuries older than the arrival of the first missionaries. The Vatican requested the immediate transfer of the dagger and chalice to Rome under the pretext of preservation. But once the items arrived, they were never shown again. They were not placed in the Vatican museums, nor listed in any official records. They vanished, absorbed into the Vatican's deep archive system, where items with difficult explanations are often placed, never to be seen again. What truly puzzled Vatican scholars, according to a letter leaked decades later, was the functional pairing of the two objects. The dagger was clearly ceremonial, used in rituals. Its edge bore traces of cinnabar, a red mineral often used to mimic blood. The chalice had internal etching, a spiral groove designed to direct liquid toward the base, an engineering detail oddly advanced for its time. The implications were disturbing. A sacrificial tool and a sacred vessel found together in a site predating European contact. Were these objects signs of an unknown convergence between Christian and Mayan ritual? Or worse, had the symbols of the Church appeared before the Church itself ever arrived? Some Vatican theologians believed the find was proof of a deeper mystery, that the concept of divine sacrifice and communion had existed in many forms across time, not just within one faith. Others feared what this would mean for doctrine. One note, handwritten and unsigned, was found tucked into the Vatican storage report for the objects. It read simply, "They were not waiting to be taught. They were remembering," and then underlined 3 times. The dagger was not meant to kill. The chalice was not meant to heal. What ceremony, then, had once bound them together in stone temples beneath jungle skies? And why did the Vatican never speak of it again? The bells of St. Peter's Basilica did not ring that night. The sky above the Vatican was clear and cold, and the square was unusually quiet for a date that had stirred such global fascination. December 21st, 2012. To most of the world, it was the day the Mayan calendar was said to end. For some, it was just another winter solstice. Underneath the polished marble surfaces of Vatican City, something extraordinary was taking place. Far below the magnificent dome, in a secret chamber known to only a select few clerics, there exists a room absent from any tourist guide and missing from all official documentation. When midnight struck, 12 figures clothed in robes entered this hidden space without sound. They displayed no golden ornaments or ceremonial grandeur. Their clothing was plain black fabric worn with age. A surface had been arranged. On it lay a cup, an ancient leather-bound tome, and a mysterious item draped in crimson fabric. One flame danced at the table's heart. The overhead lighting remained dark. Only fire illuminated the gathering. Cardinal Anton Maraldi led the assembly, a figure once known as the Church's silent enforcer. Famous for investigating doctrinal violations within confidential papers, he had stepped down 5 years prior to this evening. Still, there he stood, palms pressed together, eyelids shut. The remaining participants encircled him. Those present would later describe it as a service of witness, though such terminology appears in no religious texts. No singing voices filled the air, no assembly of believers, only hushed Latin phrases, a passage from the Apocalypse. Then occurred something never officially acknowledged. One testimony, penned anonymously by a Vatican record keeper years afterward, detailed the recitation of a different manuscript that evening. This document, they insisted, originated not from scripture. It came from a translated Mayan text, secured under lock within the apostolic collection. The excerpt described the sun falling through its last threshold and robed men beneath stone who protect the world's revolution. The concealed object remained unidentified, but following the reading it travelled from person to person until reaching the sacred table. What words were spoken then remains unknown. No documentation survived. Only a fragment endured, caught by a maintenance worker outside the chamber moments after the flame was extinguished. He is not returning. He never departed. Some interpreted the words as referring to Christ, others to Quetzalcoatl, the plumed deity of Mayan law, and some, even among church officials, have quietly pondered whether those two beings share more similarities than doctrine allows. Whatever transpired that evening stays unspoken. Publicly, Vatican City issued no statements the following day. Yet within its timeless walls, a clandestine midnight service occurred, not to celebrate the world's conclusion, but to acknowledge it in stillness. And quietude within the Vatican frequently carries more weight than any proclamation. In a secluded chamber toward the rear of the Vatican Apostolic Collection, beyond walls of steel shelving and aged parchment, a single folded paper rested within a wooden container no bigger than bread. For almost 200 years, none had opened it. None had cause to. The label read in Latin as Tractatus Obscura, the hidden treatise. Most archivists walked past believing it a misplaced monastic commentary. Yet during the summer of 2011, a young Jesuit researcher named Father Matteo Langella received exceptional permission to this forbidden section of the collection. His assignment was straightforward: to record unexamined manuscripts for electronic preservation. Yet his discovery was far from simple. The material was denser than typical parchment, resembling compressed bark. Father Langella gently unfolded it, revealing an empty page. When he positioned it nearer to the desk light, he observed something peculiar. The fibre texture shifted beneath illumination, as though something lay hidden within the page itself. He brought the lamp closer still. Nothing emerged until, following instinct, he pressed his thumb against the bottom corner. That moment revealed the signature. Faint, glowing slightly beneath his skin's warmth. A name and date. Cardinal Sebastiano Verducci, year 1672. The cardinal's identity was familiar. He had served the Inquisition's Committee for Foreign Beliefs during Spanish America's expansion peak. Yet no record existed of him composing anything deemed significant. Langella transported the parchment to a secure chamber where Vatican scientists possessed equipment for delicate document handling. Beneath the carefully heated brass surface, additional text began emerging. Line by line, the hidden ink rose from the page. It was not a treatise, it was an alert. The document outlined recurring suns and mentioned a people of flame and stone whose judgment would return not through conquest, but through cosmic alignment. It described cycles not in straight lines, but forming a serpent consuming its tail. The closing paragraph chilled the space. It declared that the Church must never permit the day of the 9th turning to pass unobserved, and that the dome should mirror the heavens when the heavens mirror the dome. The message concluded with one phrase repeated thrice in invisible ink. He walks below. None could interpret this meaning. Yet when Father Langella tried submitting the letter for translation and publication, his authorization was withdrawn. The document was resealed. He was relocated to a monastery in remote Spain. He never mentioned it again, though the digital copy, partially retrieved, reached a small circle of theologians, with some believing it directly connects to the Mayan prophecy of December 21st, 2012. The Vatican has never acknowledged the document's reality, yet still now, somewhere deep within its collections, a single page lies in darkness, its message waiting not in ink, but in warmth and silence. During Cardinal Luis Ramirez's final days, he requested only one thing: a simple wooden chair positioned beside his private study window where sunlight touched the floor after morning mass. He sought no physicians, no scripture pages. Instead, he requested a journal, weathered leather, empty pages, and a pen containing dark blue ink. He wrote deliberately, each word drawn from memory. The entries, later found in a sealed compartment beneath his quarter's tiled floor, revealed something the Vatican never anticipated. Not scandal, not personal weakness, but a quiet, growing dread rooted not in transgression but in prophecy. Cardinal Ramirez had served the Pontifical Commission for Interfaith Astronomy, a small group assigned to assess spiritual significance in global celestial myths. He was respected, systematic, and seldom questioned, yet in one entry, dated March 1976, he wrote, "We have misunderstood time's conclusion. It is neither flame nor trumpet. It is a revolution, a homecoming, and we remain unprepared." His unrest had originated years earlier when an aged codex entered Vatican possession, not from a church but from a private collector in Guatemala. It contained symbols, star charts, and references to the ninth descent of fire. Most commission members dismissed it as another Mayan legend, but Ramirez could not dismiss it. The deeper he read, the more he discovered patterns, not only in the symbols, but in Christian scripture. He identified strange connections between Mayan calendar cycles and the Book of Revelation, words that seemed to echo each other without ever meeting. He termed it a shadow teaching, one belief layered over another, creating a hidden message visible only when both were held together. In the journal, he described a night when he dreamed of St. Peter's Basilica without its dome. In its place stood a stone temple radiating crimson light. A voice declared, "You are not the first, you are merely the next." The Vatican dismissed his concerns. When he requested additional study, he was gently advised to concentrate on ecumenical diplomacy. When he insisted on addressing the College of Cardinals regarding the prophecy, he was refused. His final entry was dated December 20th, 2012, one day before the notorious Mayan prophecy date. "If the sun returns and nothing shifts, I will know I was mistaken. But if it returns and we sense nothing, we may have already crossed the threshold." Cardinal Ramirez died peacefully in his sleep that night, yet his journal remained locked beneath the floor, untouched until routine renovation in 2019 revealed the wooden compartment and its secrets. Today, few in the church will discuss it, even fewer acknowledge it was ever real. Yet the journal exists. Its ink remains vibrant, and on its final page, pressed deeply into the paper as if with trembling hands, is a single line. The serpent did not conclude time, it turned it. In a small village nestled deep within Guatemala's highlands, the morning of December 21st, 2012, commenced with silence. Not ordinary quiet, the kind preceding roosters' calls or children's stirring. This silence felt incorrect, heavy with anticipation. Elder Mateo, the village's spiritual guardian, rose before dawn as he had for over 50 years. Each morning he conducted a ritual at the ancient stone altar positioned on a cliff edge above the village. There he ignited incense and observed the first golden rays rise over eastern hills. Yet that morning, as he stood in cold air with smoke curling around him, the sky remained dark. He waited 1 minute, then 5, then 15, still no sun. When 30 minutes had elapsed, villagers had begun gathering, whispering in their native language, fear creeping into their voices. The eastern sky had started lightening, but not normally. No golden tint, just flat, strange grey, as if colour had been drained from the heavens. News spread rapidly. One woman mentioned her grandmother had warned of such a morning long ago, a prophecy whispered during illness, speaking of the day when the sun forgets to rise and time coils upon itself like smoke. At precisely 45 minutes past expected sunrise, a thin sliver of light finally broke the sky's edge. Yet it was pale, weak, and oddly formed, like a wounded eye attempting to open. Most of the world never learned what occurred in that village. No satellites monitored there, no news cameras, no scientific teams. Yet inside the Vatican Observatory, tucked away on the papal summer residence rooftop in Castel Gandolfo, 2 Jesuit astronomers quietly recorded a strange atmospheric anomaly over Central America. The file was marked inconclusive, sealed and stored, yet not everyone forgot. A letter emerged years later, addressed to a retired bishop in Mexico. It was unsigned and undated, but written in careful slanted Latin. The letter referenced the sun's hesitation and claimed it matched a line from a forbidden codex. "In the turning of the 9th fire the light shall pause, and man shall forget how time moves forward." The bishop never replied, yet the letter was later found among his personal belongings, along with a photograph of the village altar and a note scribbled on the back. Vigilantibus tempus loquitur. Time speaks to those who keep watch. Some claim what happened that morning was merely weather, an unusual fog, a light trick. Yet in that quiet village, they still speak of it. They say the sun did not simply delay, they say it listened, and then it chose. And somewhere in the Vatican's sealed collections, behind doors guarded by silence, there may be one more entry in a forgotten logbook, where a quiet priest noted the sun was late but not lost. In the weeks following December 21st, 2012, something subtle began stirring beneath the Vatican's public composure. While the world dismissed the Mayan prophecy as failed mythology, a quiet transformation was already occurring. There were no press statements, no announcements, yet one by one black-robed figures began reappearing in places they had not been seen for decades. The Jesuits were travelling south again. It began in Guatemala, then extended into Belize's rainforests, Honduras and southern Mexico. These were not typical missionary expeditions. These priests did not preach in town squares or conduct mass in humble village chapels. They arrived with containers, notebooks, and peculiar instruments. They came under darkness, stayed in remote monasteries, and spoke with elders whose stories had long been regarded as folklore. The locals named them Los Hombres de Negro, the men in black. To outsiders, they were archaeologists, linguists, perhaps even relief workers. Yet to those paying attention, the signs were evident. These were Vatican agents trained in history, astronomy, and ancient languages. Their purpose was not conversion, it was recovery. A small team visited Copan's ruins. Another was spotted deep near Tikal, quietly photographing carvings exposed after heavy rain washed away jungle soil layers. In one village, a 70-year-old woman remembered a young priest asking about the story of the serpent living under time. When she asked who sent him, he only smiled and said, "The same ones who came before." The silence. "What silence?" she asked. The silence that began when the fire was missed. Back in Rome, inside a quiet study chamber of the Vatican Library, a folder lay open across a table. Inside were printed reports, handwritten notes, and several photographs. One photograph showed a crumbling stone wall covered in symbols. Another showed what appeared to be a circular carving split into 13 segments, each marked with a date. The final date, December 21st, 2012. Yet beneath that date, a new marking had appeared. Fresh, unweathered, as if someone had added it recently. One Jesuit report simply stated, "The calendar is not finished, it is turning." What frightened some within the Vatican was not that the prophecy had failed, but that it had not concluded. It had only paused. And now those in black robes were walking again under southern skies, chasing whispers through stone and shadow, seeking what the world had ignored. They were not searching for the world's end. They were preparing for what came after. It arrived without ceremony, tucked between routine bulletins on canon law and saintly beatifications. The date was January 16th, 2013. The headline read, "Theological Reflection on the Passage of Errors." Few noticed it. Fewer still read it. Yet for those who did, one sentence stood out like a candle flickering in a hidden crypt. Time belongs to God alone. To casual readers, it was harmless enough, a poetic phrase buried in religious language. Yet to those familiar with the Vatican's deeper collections and the strange tension that had lingered since December 21st of the previous year, it whispered of something more, a quiet admission, a soft confirmation that something had passed, something significant though still unspoken. The statement was authored by the Pontifical Commission for Doctrine and History. It avoided direct mention of the Mayan calendar prophecy or the year's many public speculations. Yet hidden in its language were unmistakable references to cycles, to renewal, to the mystery of sacred time, calculated in patterns known to ancient peoples. The document referenced St. Augustine's writings on time as God's creation. Still, it also made space for the wisdom of cultures that viewed time as circular, echoing divine creation's endless mercy. That line alone caused quiet debate in certain curia corners. Circular time? That was not Catholic tradition. That was something else. In a private meeting room beneath the Apostolic Palace, a small group of senior archivists read the statement with furrowed brows. One of them, Father Benedetti, folded the page and placed it down carefully. "They are speaking truth," he said quietly, "just not all of it." What remained unsaid spoke louder than anything printed. There was no denial of the prophecies, no dismissal of the calendars, no condemnation of the strange alignments that had led the world to hold its breath on the 2012 winter solstice. Instead, the Vatican had issued a message not to the world but to history itself. One cardinal later described it as a theological exhale, an acknowledgement that the Church had passed through something even if it could not define what that something was. Behind closed doors, there were whispers that the statement had originally included a second page, later removed before publication, a page that reportedly referenced the completion of a hidden cycle and the return of ancient understanding. Yet if that page ever existed, it was never seen again. For the faithful, the bulletin was a quiet note of reassurance. For those who had been watching closely, it was something more. It was a sign. The prophecy may have passed without fire from the sky, yet the Vatican had spoken. And in their silence about what truly happened, they had confirmed everything. Time had turned, and the secrets were still unfolding. Behind the bronze doors of the Vatican Apostolic Collection lies a world most will never see. Row after row of locked cabinets, untouched manuscripts, and maps with redacted markings stretch into cold silence. Few speak of what rests on those shelves, and fewer still are permitted to know. Still, somewhere behind those guarded walls are the records that speak of the Mayans, the prophecy, and the night the Church chose not to remember. When the winter solstice of 2012 came and went, the world breathed relief. No fire, no ending. Yet inside the Vatican, whispers stirred once more, this time not among the curious, but the cautious. The prophecy had not been dismissed. It had been delayed. 1 week after the solstice, a high-ranking archivist known only as Father Ricci was relieved of duty. His office was cleared, his key to Section Epsilon revoked. No reason was given publicly. Yet someone later noticed that his research log included a final entry, dated December 21st. Codex Vez, seal intact, light unknown, entry denied. None could confirm what that meant. Yet inside the archives, light has a strange meaning. There are rooms where documents are stored, not by age, but by what they do under light. Some respond to fire, some to water, and a few, according to legend, only speak under starlight. Section Epsilon, the most restricted wing of the archive, is rumoured to house documents recovered from colonial outposts in the New World. Texts written in ancient symbols, reports from vanished priests, and one sealed container labelled only with a serpent symbol, and a date written in Mayan numerals. The Church has never officially admitted this section exists. Still, cardinals have spoken of it in veiled language during late-night homilies and private audiences. One such moment happened in 2015, when a visiting scholar was permitted a tour of the General Archive. While walking past a locked hallway, the Vatican escort reportedly whispered, "That wing is closed. The stars have not aligned." In that one sentence, everything was said. The secrets of the prophecy, whatever truths they contain, are not denied. They are simply kept hidden behind stone, locked in history's quiet breath. Waiting. A journalist once filed a petition to view post-colonial missionary documents, including those from the Yucatan. The response came swiftly. No such documents exist within the publicly available archive. Not denied, not confirmed, just not available. And so the story waits, not dead, not dismissed, but sealed in silence. The Mayan prophecy may have spoken of endings, yet the Vatican's response has always been the same. Not now, not yet. The archive remains sealed, and the mystery just beneath its marble floors continues to pulse softly, patiently, like a heartbeat. Beneath centuries of stone, there was once an artifact that never should have left the jungle. It was not gold, or carved bone, or anything a museum would display. It was a mirror, flat, black, and smooth as still water. Yet it did not reflect like any mirror in the modern world. When light struck it, it shimmered like smoke, and when darkness filled the room, it was said to glow faintly with a red pulse, like breath waiting to be drawn. The mirror came from the ruins of a collapsed Mayan temple deep in Guatemala's lowlands. It was discovered in 1971 by a group of Vatican-sponsored researchers operating under the name Domus Lux. Officially, they were there to document missionary trails. Unofficially, they were searching for something the Vatican had been quietly tracking for decades. What they called the Eye of Time. It was packed into a wooden crate and flown not to Rome, but to a monastery just outside Florence. There, under the careful watch of Jesuit scholars, the mirror was studied for several months. Notes from those sessions were never made public. Yet one letter remains, tucked inside a journal left behind by Brother Tommaso. In it, he writes, "We covered all windows. Still, the mirror sees light that is not present. Last night a shadow passed across it, yet no one else was in the room." Soon after, Brother Tommaso was transferred to silence. His records end there. 2 months later, the mirror was gone. Not missing, returned by hand. The Vatican made no announcement, yet locals in the region where the mirror had first been found spoke of a small, pale-skinned priest who arrived at dawn carrying a black cloth bundle and asking for the elders. He was brought to the centre of the old village square, where an overgrown stone platform still rested. He unwrapped the mirror and placed it back into the earth. No words, no blessing, just silence. Then he left. To this day, no one knows who the priest was. No records match his description, and the bundle remains buried beneath what is now thick forest. A research team tried to retrieve it in 2003, yet flooding blocked their path. They never returned. Some say the mirror was not meant to reflect faces, but futures. Others say it was simply a lens, one part of a larger mechanism the Mayans used to measure cycles of destruction and rebirth. Either way, the Church no longer speaks of it. The name Domus Lux has vanished from their books. Still even now, on certain nights, when the moon is full and the wind quiets, those who live near the buried stones say they see flickers not from the sky, but from below, as if the mirror had never stopped watching and had never truly been returned to stone. They departed in silence, one by one, under cloudy skies that had once watched their arrival with promise. The Jesuits, who had spent decades walking the humid paths of Central America, were suddenly recalled without explanation. No farewells were spoken aloud, only quiet prayers in Latin offered behind shuttered chapel doors. In the jungle villages, the people noticed. Children who had been taught to read by candlelight asked where the black-robed men had gone. Elders who had shared their stories and stars with the visitors sensed an unease drifting in the air, heavier than the rain. No answer came from Rome, only orders. The instructions had been explicit. Father Matteo was among the final group to depart. His notebooks, containing charts and Maya hieroglyphs, were secured and prepared for shipment. Yet one sheet was absent. Not ripped, not lost, simply disappeared. What made this particularly disturbing was that this page detailed his conversation with a local priest regarding the night when celestial bodies formed perfect alignment. The indigenous man had described an ancient blaze across the heavens, one prophesied in carved stone and reflected in stellar patterns. The document that captured those words, those precise locations, had vanished completely, Upon Father Matteo's arrival in Rome, he was housed in quarters distant from public view. His correspondence was scrutinized. His inquiries remained unanswered. Within just 3 months, illness struck him. Some claimed it was tropical disease from the wilderness. Others whispered it was sorrow. Yet within Vatican walls, discussions continued quietly. Cardinals murmured about disturbing findings by the Jesuits, discoveries that defied the Church's established historical narrative. Perhaps a prophecy, or something more troubling. Proof that Maya comprehension of temporal cycles might challenge or exceed the Gregorian system implemented centuries before. The breaking point arrived not from ancient texts, but from a drawing. A young Jesuit still working in remote regions had dispatched it to Rome. The sketch depicted a temple facade recently exposed following seasonal floods. Carved deeply into the stone surface was an image that shouldn't have existed in that location or era. A flawless depiction of the Christian cross, encircled by flames, and below it a man's face bearing European characteristics, crowned with stellar symbols. This discovery, more than any manuscript or mystical vision, prompted the immediate recall order for all Jesuits. Not because their mission had failed, but because they had witnessed too much. Even today, the Vatican maintains no official documentation of this withdrawal. Records remain locked away, reports stay classified. However, in a passageway illuminated by wavering torches beneath the apostolic residence, there exists an unmarked filing cabinet bearing only a date, 1731. Within it, according to legend, lies Father Matteo's final correspondence, a message written not to any human recipient, but addressed to the cosmos itself. The downpour had continued unbroken for 72 hours. An endless, murmuring curtain of water descended upon the southern Mexican mountains, drenching the stone walkways once shaped by ancient artisans. High in the remote peaks, a small procession moved carefully through thick fog. Leading the group, protected in waterproof canvas and bound with scarlet cord, was an artifact known to only a select few within Vatican circles, the feathered crucifix. It bore no resemblance to any cross displayed in Rome, no burnished timber, no precious metals. Instead, it was hewn from deep emerald stone, nearly obsidian in shadow. Secured to its centre were numerous long, shimmering plumes, brilliant azure, scarlet and jade, so luminous they appeared almost living. The plumes reportedly came from the Quetzal, sacred in Maya tradition, believed to transport messages between earth and heaven. This cross's origins were never formally documented. It was discovered in 1886 within a sealed tomb beneath a destroyed mission chapel. The building had been abandoned, strangled by vegetation and wild herbs. Yet the cross, untouched by decay or fire, stood erect within a ring of stones. At its foundation were markings in both Latin and Nahuatl. One phrase appeared repeatedly. The relic was immediately conveyed to Rome. But Pope Leo III at that time refused to house it within St. Peter's Basilica. He commanded it be examined in secrecy, deep below the Vatican archives. For almost 100 years the cross remained there, wrapped and guarded. Some believed it possessed visionary powers. Others feared it was an artifact not of the Church, but of something more ancient, something that preceded both cross and crown. Then came the foretelling. As the world approached 2012, Vatican researchers revisited forgotten manuscripts, seeking overlooked patterns. One text, handwritten in 16th century Spanish, described a sacred journey undertaken by a native priest and a silent Jesuit. Together, they transported the cross to a summit where stars had once descended. There they waited for divine indication. In spring 2011, the Vatican discreetly assembled a team. Not warriors, not clergy, simply observers. Their mission was straightforward. Return the cross, not to Rome, but to its original resting place. No documentation, no publicity, no evidence. Somewhere high in the jungle mountains, the feathered cross was restored to its home. No marker indicates the location, but indigenous people speak of a clearing where birds refuse to perch, where the atmosphere always feels dense, and where, on certain nights, mysterious lights flicker through the foliage, azure, scarlet and jade, exactly like plumes. The Vatican never acknowledged this pilgrimage, but one photograph reached a researcher in 2014. It showed an elderly man kneeling in mud, his palms pressed against a stone cross adorned with feathers. On the photograph's reverse, one word was scrawled in crimson: restored. He entered Rome discreetly, as most academics do. His name was Miguel Ferreira, a gentle historian from Lisbon who studied connections between pre-Columbian astronomy and early ecclesiastical doctrine. He wore heavy spectacles, walked with a minor limp, and carried journals bound in supple brown leather. In 2006, the Vatican granted him exceptional access to its private collections. Miguel pursued neither influence nor politics. He sought patterns. Particularly, he was captivated by the curious mathematical correlations between Maya star charts and the calendar modifications introduced by Pope Gregory. He believed this convergence was not accidental, but evidence of something more ancient at work, something deeper, perhaps something the Church had always understood. Each morning, following Mass, Miguel would enter through the bronze portals of the Vatican secret archives. He passed silent sentries, descended marble staircases, and entered chambers where time seemed thick and sluggish. Within, beneath layers of dust and secured containers, he discovered fragments, correspondence from Jesuits who had travelled into Central America, field observations written in Nahuatl and Latin, and one unusual document dated 1672. The parchment was delicate, yet the ink, remarkably, remained vivid. It described a shared vision between a missionary and a native spiritual leader, both witnesses to a spiral of light in the southern heavens followed by 9 days of absolute quiet. At the document's bottom, a caution was inscribed: non omnibus licet videre, not everyone is permitted to witness. Miguel recorded observations. He compared the date with Maya eclipse documentation, Vatican astrological records, and correspondence from Jesuit astronomers. A pattern started emerging, one suggesting cycles and a prophecy connected not to destruction but to homecoming. Then, one morning Miguel failed to appear. Guards assumed illness. His notebooks remained in his study room, undisturbed, still open to a page about Quetzalcoatl. But his overcoat was absent, his spectacles too. Initially, no alarm was raised. People arrive and depart, even within Vatican halls. By the third day, however, worry mounted. A search commenced. His quarters at the Domus Sancta Mart were untouched. The bed remained made. His travel documents and luggage stayed behind, but Miguel had vanished. The final person to observe him was a nun working in the archive's adjacent restoration laboratory. She recalled seeing him pause beside a statue of St. Michael. Just before closing, he had been murmuring something in Portuguese. She caught only one word. Espelho, he whispered. Mirror. No public statement was issued. His access was quietly terminated. His notebooks were withdrawn from circulation. However, a colleague from Lisbon later claimed receiving a mysterious package. Inside was one torn page from Miguel's journal. Marked in red ink, it read, "They understood the stars but feared the reflection, nothing more." There's something peaceful about standing in St. Peter's Square at daybreak. The illumination is gentle, the shadows stretch long, and the great obelisk at the centre rises like a silent guardian of lost ages. Tourists seldom notice it. They hurry towards the basilica, gazing upward at the dome. But the obelisk has been observing longer, much longer. It originated from Egypt, from Heliopolis, where sun deities once walked in legends older than Rome. Emperor Caligula had it transported across the Mediterranean. In the 1st century, it required vessels, cables, and hundreds of workers to move stone that seemed to resist movement. He positioned it where his circus operated. Years afterward, it would witness the Apostle Peter's upside-down crucifixion nearby. None could have imagined that the pyramid-topped monument and the first pope would share a moment in history. But centuries later, within the Vatican's private study chambers, that connection began troubling certain scholars. One Jesuit priest named Father Vincenzo discovered a collection of early Christian letters stored in the Codices Vaticani. Among them, he found an unusual letter addressed not to a bishop, but to a Roman architect. The correspondence warned against placing a solar monument on the martyr's site and mentioned stars, serpent pathways and lines drawn between continents. Father Vincenzo became fixated. He believed the obelisk was more than a Roman trophy. He believed it was a marker, an indicator. When plotted on a globe alongside other ancient obelisks and pyramids from Giza to Teotihuacan, a pattern appeared. Not one of conquest, but of wisdom, a language carved in stone. He presented his theory to superiors quietly, respectfully. But the Vatican's response was, do not mistake signs for stories. Father Vincenzo was transferred. His documents were archived under symbolic theology. Yet some pages escaped beyond the walls. One sheet particularly reached a Maya scholar in Chiapas. That page displayed a drawing of the St. Peter's Square obelisk overlaid with a serpent formed by stars. The same stellar serpent found in Maya glyphs referring to the return of divine teachers, beings who promised to return when the sun's journey reached completion. Here, beneath the Vatican dome, the serpent curved again, right at the feet of the fisherman apostle, St. Peter, keeper of the keys, standing beside a pyramid from the era of sun gods. Coincidence? A symbol hidden in plain view? Late at night, under the warm lamps of the Vatican Library, occasional whispered conversations still revisit that question. Not as fact, not as doctrine, but as a puzzle too strange to ignore. They say when the sun sits directly overhead during summer solstice, the obelisk's shadow aligns with a point beneath the basilica, a chamber sealed since Pope Sixtus V's reign. That chamber contains no relics, only a map and silence. It was 1983 when the Vatican made an announcement that astonished the world. Pope John Paul II would not be visiting the great cathedrals of Europe or the spiritual centre of Jerusalem. Instead, he would venture somewhere few expected a pope to go, deep into the Central American rainforests, into lands once governed by the Maya. The official explanation was straightforward. The Holy Father wished to engage with indigenous communities, to speak peace, to foster unity. But behind the ceremonial meetings and white vestments lay another narrative, whispered only in the quiet marble hallways of the Apostolic Palace. One of the Vatican's missionaries had sent a handwritten letter, smuggled through a network of old Jesuit contacts. It was brief, written in Spanish, and contained only a single phrase in bold lettering. They have unsealed the temple and it resonates at night. The words were cryptic, enigmatic. Yet something within them captured the Holy Father's attention. Within days, preparations for the papal journey were quietly modified. The Guatemala visit, scheduled for one day, was extended. A detour to Petén, the jungle province near ancient Tikal, was arranged. No explanation was provided. Local guides remember it clearly. The security was more intense than anticipated. The Pope travelled not only with priests, but with a small group of academics and one elderly Jesuit whose identity was never listed in press materials. They say the group reached a ruined temple just after sunset, and there they waited for something unexplained. A Vatican photographer, now retired, recalled hearing something that evening. A low vibration, not mechanical, not wind, but rhythmic, as if the stones themselves were breathing. When he turned to question one of the scholars about it, he was told gently, "The calendar doesn't just measure time, It listens to it. The following morning, the Pope offered a brief blessing, smiled for photographers, and said very little. But when a reporter asked what he had witnessed in the forest, his response was peculiar. He said, "We are not the first to await the world's end, and we will not be the last." After returning to Rome, no public statement was made about the jungle visit, but something shifted. Within months, a small team of Vatican archivists was dispatched to re-examine documents connected to early American missions. Their work, according to one staff member, focused not on theology, but on astronomy. Why would a pope leave the comfort of marble halls to walk among crumbling temples? Why would a man of the cross stand silently before stone that once honoured sky gods? Perhaps the answer lies not in what was spoken, but in what was sensed, and in the sound that resonated through the stones, the sound the Vatican never explained. The jungle was dense with mist the morning they discovered him, an elderly man wrapped in weathered fabric, leaning against the roots of a ceiba tree, his eyes half closed but watching the heavens. His name was never recorded. Nobody wrote it down. In the reports later sent to the Vatican, he was simply called the final priest of the ancient gods. He shouldn't have been there. Spanish missionaries had swept through the area more than 4 centuries earlier, destroying temples, shattering altars, and baptizing survivors. Yet somehow this man had endured, or perhaps what he embodied had endured through him. The village children first heard his voice. He spoke in an ancient dialect, Mopan, or perhaps something even older, a language of stone and flame. When asked his identity, he gave no name, only a position. "I am the guardian of the 13th step." News spread rapidly. Anthropologists came, as did local officials, and shortly after, a quiet man from the Vatican's diplomatic corps. His credentials revealed no rank, but he wore a simple silver cross that others acknowledged with bows. They brought in a translator, a Jesuit who had once studied in the Chiapas hills. The old priest's words came slowly, one statement at a time, as though each one bore weight too heavy for his frame. He said the stars were no longer in harmony, that the calendar had reached a stillness, not an ending. And then he said something that chilled the room. The serpent has turned its gaze, and Rome cannot see it. At first, nobody comprehended, but as the Vatican representative took notes, his hand hesitated, just slightly. Later, in a report kept from public view, he would underline the phrase 3 times. The old priest died that same evening. No suffering, just a long breath and peace as he closed his eyes. He whispered one final statement to the translator, and this too was recorded. "Tell the man in white that the door opens once and never again." Back in Rome, the translator attempted to explain the phrase. Some said it meant great change was approaching, one that couldn't be undone. Others believed it referred to the sky, perhaps a cosmic event or a moment hidden in prophecy. But the Vatican did not respond. No statement was issued. The silver cross was returned to a drawer, and the papers were filed deep beneath St. Peter's Basilica. Yet something remained. The sense that the final priest had not spoken to the village or to the scholar, but directly to the church's heart. A message not of warning, but of remembrance that the past is not gone. It's only waiting like a serpent beneath stone for the next time the stars begin to turn. In the long marble corridors of the Apostolic Palace, silence often conveys more than words. The Vatican has perfected the art of quiet. When something disturbing emerges, whispers of a lost gospel, a strange celestial alignment, or an old Mayan prophecy that rings too true, the Church doesn't need to deny it. It only needs to outlive the commotion. But this time, silence carried significance. It started with correspondence. Not just any correspondence, but one bearing the seal of a Central American bishop. The document described an incident, small, obscure, about a cave discovered deep in the Petén forest. Inside were markings, not just Maya, but startlingly similar to early Christian symbolism. Crosses, a fish, even a familiar 12-pointed star. But what troubled the bishop was not the symbols themselves. It was the date carved beneath them, December 21st, 2012. The letter made its way quietly to Rome. There was no press release, no denial, no correction. Only a silence that stretched on unanswered. Some expected a statement. The Church had always been quick to reject such claims before. End times predictions, disaster warnings, ancient calendar theories. This time, however, they said nothing at all. For those paying attention, that silence spoke volumes. Within the Vatican's inner circles, tension began to build. Cardinal Ernesto de Rossi, respected for his devotion and his love of ancient history, whispered concerns to his trusted allies. Our refusal to respond reveals more than we realise. The archives stayed locked tight, but beyond those protected walls, copies of the bishop's correspondence were stored alongside much older materials. Records of crimson stars that blazed for 3 consecutive nights, charts created by Jesuit explorers who insisted the planet moved through cycles rather than simple years. Every document received its stamp, its classification number, its place in rooms where almost no one would ever see them. Still, beyond Vatican City, the world continued asking the same question. Why hadn't anyone simply said no? A scholar from the University of Salamanca quietly published research highlighting striking similarities between ancient Mayan texts and certain passages from Revelation. A former Vatican astronomer gave an enigmatic interview, stating only that we acknowledge fewer calendars than actually exist. Rome remained quiet, even as the story hit major newspapers, even as conspiracy websites exploded with theories across the globe. Even when they discovered a seminary student breaking into the archive chambers, hunting for references to the phrase, "the serpent returns in flames." Maybe it was calculated. Maybe it was just careful planning. But the Vatican's refusal to speak said more than any official statement. Sometimes the words we don't say carry more weight than those we do. For anyone listening carefully, the Church had already given its answer. It simply chose to speak softly. For decades, people mocked the ancient prediction. They scoffed at the date etched in stone by a vanished civilization, December 21st, 2012. The day arrived and passed. No burning skies, no rising seas, no cities consumed by earthquakes. But hidden within Vatican walls, certain individuals had never found it amusing. They refused to dismiss the prophecy because they understood its true meaning. It had never predicted destruction, not in the way everyone expected. Father Miguel Santero was one of these believers, a reserved academic who seldom ventured beyond the Vatican library. His days were spent bent over ancient scrolls and fragile manuscripts. His most treasured text wasn't even officially catalogued. It was a scattered collection of Mayan symbols matched with Latin commentary written by a Jesuit missionary in 1694. Those notes revealed that the prophecy never foretold the world's destruction. It described the end of one world. That distinction meant everything. Father Santero discovered a line that appeared repeatedly throughout the text. The serpent does not consume the earth, it molts its skin. He marked it each time, highlighted it, spoke it quietly, like a sacred verse. The prophecy wasn't about falling fire or colliding asteroids. It concerned transformation, transition, something far less spectacular than total annihilation, yet infinitely more threatening to an organization like the Vatican. It implied that time wasn't a straight line, that history moved in patterns, that one era had concluded while another was beginning. The true threat wasn't destruction, but awakening. The Mayans taught that each great era ended with opportunity, a gateway, a moment when the barrier between realities became fragile, when long-hidden truths could finally emerge. If humanity started believing this, genuinely accepting it, the world wouldn't perish. It would evolve. What would this mean for the Church? The Vatican had spent centuries as the guardian of narratives, mysteries, divine structure. A shift in belief could shatter that foundation. People might start questioning fundamental assumptions: the calendar, the crucifixion, the power that linked them together. Instead of opposing the prophecy directly, the Vatican chose to wait. The date came and went. Nothing ignited, and humanity returned to ordinary concerns. Father Santero, however, remained vigilant. On December 21st, 2012, he kept watch in the archive chamber. No timepiece, no flame for light. Only his steady breathing and an intuition that something ancient had just shifted. Dawn brought him a fragment of old parchment, a note in fading ink, written in Latin. You searched in the correct location, but not during the proper moment. No signature appeared, but the wax seal was impossible to mistake. It bore the mark of the Sacred Congregation for the Doctrine of the Faith. Even in the most protected corridors, the prophecy had never truly been abandoned, merely concealed, and possibly deliberately misinterpreted. Thank you for joining us through this complete exploration. If any of these enigmas captured your interest or sparked fresh questions, share your thoughts in the comments section. We examine each response carefully. If this story resonated with you, remember to subscribe and activate notifications so you won't miss future tales from history's secret places. Rest peacefully, keep wondering, and we'll meet again in our next episode.